Thank you.
So, good morning. A few more people walking through the door. So thank you for coming to the Government Accountability and Transparency Board public meeting. First, I'd like to apologize for not having the meeting as it was originally scheduled in January, and for the relatively short notice, without going back out through a Federal Register notice process that we thought would take us out into March to do this, that for those people who had responded the first time to the first Federal Register notice, we went and touched all of them, and then we posted it on our websites. If as we go through this we find a need to hold another public meeting, we will do so. The GATT Board was chartered in June of 2011, and it was to bring strategic direction to transparency and the ability to detect waste, fraud, and abuse. Today's purpose is for the GATT Board to engage with the public and to get the public's thoughts on what we can do to improve the way the federal government views transparency and detects waste, fraud, and abuse. The majority of the GATT Board is here this morning, and I'm just going to ask if they would each introduce themselves. Allison, can you start?
Certainly. Thank you. I'm Allison Lerner. I'm the Inspector General at the National Science Foundation.
I'm Norman Dong. I'm the Interim Controller at OMB.
Good morning. I'm Cal Scoville, Inspector General for Department of Transportation.
I'm David Williams, Inspector General of the Postal Service.
And our Vice Chair.
I'm Kathy Tai. I am Department of Education Inspector General and Chair, Recovery, Accountability, and Transparency Board.
Morning. I'm Ellen Murray. I'm Assistant Secretary for Financial Resources at the Department of Health and Human Services.
Good morning. And last, but I hope not least, I'm Dan Levinson. I'm the Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services.
So the audience today, in addition to the speakers and the GATT Board, includes both federal and state agencies. And I think at the count I had 8 or 9 different federal agencies that are represented, most that are in positions that deal with the actual posting and delivery of data to the public so that they have an opportunity to hear as well. I'd like to thank Kathy Tai for making this facility available to us today. It is being webcast so that as you're up here speaking, you are potentially being seen. Can we tell how many people are actually watching? I don't know. I've never done a webcast before, so this is my first opportunity. So in broader terms, the GATT Board and what we're attempting to do as a board from a transparency and waste, fraud, and abuse is part of the larger open government partnership that is run from the White House. Nancy DePaulo is going to have a few administrative remarks. From a schedule perspective, I think we have everybody scheduled for 20 minutes. There is a 20-minute break at 10:30. I'm going to try and keep this on schedule. If the speakers speak less than 20 minutes and there are questions from the audience, we can do it then. And then at the end, we have another time, depending on when we end, to take questions from the audience, and then we'll close and hopefully be finished at 12:30. So Nancy?
Thanks, Dick. I think you actually handled most of these administrative remarks. Thank you all for coming and for jumping through the hoops of the changes and the registration and the security. There are restrooms to the right for women, to the left for men. Apparently you do need an escort, but I don't know how far you can go without that escort.
I think the restrooms.
Okay, so restrooms, 2 thumbs up. Snack bar on 7, need an escort. I just want to remind everybody, all the mics you see are live, they are hot, and this is being webcast. It's also being recorded. So just a Washington, D.C. notice. You've been forewarned. And Dick, I will.
Nancy, thank you. So our first speaker, our speakers are Bill Christian and Deb Collier from the Citizens Against Government Waste.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Board. By way of introduction, our names are William M. Christian, Director of Government Affairs for Citizens Against Government Waste, and Deborah Collier, Director of Technology and Telecommunications Policy at CAGW. Our colleague, Sean Kennedy, CAGW's Director of Research, could not be with us today, but his views are also provided in today's statement. CAGW is a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to educating the American public about waste, mismanagement, and inefficiency in the federal government. Celebrating our 30th anniversary this year, CAGW was founded in 1984 by the late industrialist J. Peter Grace and nationally syndicated columnist Jack Anderson to build support for the implementation of President Ronald Reagan's Grace Commission recommendations and other waste-cutting proposals. Since its inception, CAGW has been at the forefront of the fight for efficiency, economy, and accountability in government. We have more than 1 million members and supporters nationwide, and over the past 30 years have helped save taxpayers $1.3 trillion through the implementation of Grace Commission findings and other recommendations. CAGW does not accept government funds. Our mission reflects the interest of taxpayers. It is no secret that wasteful spending is present throughout the federal government and that every agency could perform its functions more effectively and efficiently. The first modern comprehensive effort to reform government and/or eliminate wasteful spending occurred through the Commission on Reorganization of the Federal Government, which was established by Congress in 1947 under President Harry Truman and became known as the Hoover Commission, as it was led by former President Herbert Hoover. The Commission met from 1947 to 1949 and again from 1953 to 1955. More than 70% of the recommendations were implemented by executive and legislative action, including the establishment of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, as well as the General Services Administration. The next comprehensive study of the federal government occurred under President Reagan, who created the President's Private Sector Survey on Cost Control in the Federal Government in 1982, which became better known as the Grace Commission. The Commission issued its final report in 1984 and made 2,478 recommendations that would have saved $424.4 billion in the first 3 years after full implementation of the recommendations. Through executive orders, President Reagan helped save $100 billion. The administration's annual reports on management of the federal government tracked the implementation of Grace Commission recommendations and provided a list of initiatives that were included in the President's budget. Recommendations to eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse and mismanagement are regularly provided by the GAO, the CBO, the President's budget, and Congress. Outside of the government, think tanks, advocacy groups, and private sector companies also provide ongoing analysis of government expenditures. For example, since 1993, CAGW has released Prime Cuts, a compendium of recommendations that emanate from both public and private sources. Some still date back to the Grace Commission. The most recent edition of Prime Cuts identified 557 recommendations that would save taxpayers $580.6 billion in the first year and $1.8 trillion over 5 years. Prime Cuts can serve as a blueprint to cut government spending and put the nation on a path towards fiscal stability. Throughout the year, CAGW produces other thoughtful, well-researched articles, issue briefs, and other publications targeted towards spending by the federal government. Under the stewardship of Deb Collier, CAGW completed a research project where we tried to use some of the transparency tools provided by the federal government, and we offer it today as an example for the board's consideration.
We know that technology is available that can help bridge the gap in transparency between the government and the taxpayers it serves. This technology must be used efficiently by government agencies in order to provide the information needed to improve that transparency and accountability. In October 2012, CAGW published an issue brief entitled Government Mobile Apps Proliferate. This report highlights the wasteful and often duplicative nature of federal mobile applications. Frequently, these mobile apps duplicated efforts already being made by the private sector or by other federal agencies. In researching government spending on mobile apps, CAGW staff reviewed information on USA.gov to learn what mobile apps had been developed, Federal Business Opportunities, otherwise known as FedBizOpps, to learn about upcoming contracting opportunities for future government mobile apps, the Federal Register, and USAspending.gov to determine the amount of funding spent on mobile apps. As noted in the report, while it is easy to find available apps through USA.gov website, it was much more difficult to discern the expenditure to develop each app. Searches on FedBizOp and USAspending.gov revealed scant information on line item spending. CAGW staff also reviewed individual agency websites to find information on government mobile app spending, primarily for those apps that were issued through agency-sponsored competitions with awards ranging from $2,000 to $30,000 for each winning application. However, there is often little indication on agency websites as to whether or not the agency partnered with a private sector sponsor to help pay for the prize awards, or if the taxpayer footed the entire bill. To formulate a back-of-the-envelope estimate of total cost for applications available on USA.gov's website, CAGW turned to published private sector industry experts in order to determine approximate costs for such mobile apps. Using their estimates of between $10,000 to $200,000 with an average cost of $30,000 depending on level of complexity, CAGW estimated that the federal government had paid approximately $3.6 million for the 120 mobile apps it had already deployed by the end of 2012. To say that using the USAspending.gov website was frustrating is an understatement. Searches using terms such as mobile app, mobile application, website, and mobile yielded many more search results than were applicable to the project at hand. Yet each different search criteria yielded some new instances of the creation of a new mobile app not previously found. This continues through today. For example, a recent search on the USAspending.gov website for the term mobile app found contracts for hand tools, lectures for training, modifications to contracts for solar power upgrades to the National Solar Thermal Test Facility, and firefighting equipment, in addition to e-books and mobile apps for technical education. However, a search for cloud computing services on USAspending.gov provides much clearer information about spending for these services, in part because the agencies are using standard terminology to define cloud computing services in their descriptions. This may be due to the prioritization of cloud computing services under the Cloud First provisions of the administration's 25-point plan to reform federal information technology. These contracts are very specific to cloud computing services and provide a better picture of the federal government's total spending on these services. In comparing these two searches, it is evident that clearly defined standard terminology must be used and available to the public for each type of product or service where information is being sought. If the federal government continues to use USAspending.gov as the baseline structure for transparency in federal spending, search criteria must be standardized, defined, and consistently used by those entering the data. Otherwise, locating information about spending on various products and services will remain difficult for the average user. CAGW's research director, Sean Kennedy, also used USAspending.gov website. Mr. Kennedy is routinely charged with determining funding levels for particular research projects. This can include researching funding for a particular program, which might entail looking up the appropriated amount, the House, Senate, or conference version of the appropriated amount, whether or not the program received a funding request from the administration, and so on. At other times, he attempted to use USAspending.gov to determine more macro figures, such as how much a particular agency received in funding compared to prior years. USAspending.gov and Recovery.gov were particularly helpful in researching items contained in the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. The search tools allowed users insight into various stimulus programs that was not available in a comprehensive form elsewhere. This included tracking repayment schedules for stimulus funding when applicable. These sites are also helpful to determine information relating to contractors. Unfortunately, these websites lost their utility when given the existence of outside research tools. According to Mr. Kennedy, USAspending.gov does not respond well when a researcher attempts to locate specific funding levels of programs or purchased items. For instance, trying to locate the amount of money directed toward an item such as the M1 Abrams tank by the DoD in a given year is a difficult task. In addition, there is little sophistication to the information. The user is not able to determine where the funding request originated, whether it was initiated by Congress, requested by the executive branch, or if it was an administration request that was further augmented by Congress. For this example, it is much easier to consult the relevant legislation. While the bills are not particularly searchable, users will get better results using the source documents.
While we recognize the various shortcomings of the current system, we would not suggest scrapping the platform. Instead, we would prefer that the current infrastructure, to include lessons learned from its implementation to date, be remedied rather than starting over from scratch. Indeed, CAGW is loath to add another example of redundant, overlapping, or duplicative procurement of federal IT assets to our current rogues gallery of waste. We already know that federal IT mismanagement is a long-standing problem. From 2001 to 2012, federal IT spending grew by 76%, from $46 billion to $81 billion. Unfortunately, according to Oversight and Government Reform Committee Chairman Darrell Iss's opening statement, at a January 2013 hearing on wasteful IT spending, federal managers estimate as much as $20 billion of taxpayer money is squandered on IT every year. CAGW shares the goals of open data, that it be structured, standardized, and accessible. The transformation of government information from paper and plain text to open data, as espoused by the Data Transparency Coalition, or DTC, requires conceptually simple steps that become very difficult in practice. First, apply consistent data standards, common identifiers, uniform formats, and the like, across diverse agencies and systems. Second, publish the compilation online so that it can be searched and scrutinized by everyone. The legislative vehicle for data transparency and spending is the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act, or DATA Act, which was simultaneously introduced in the House and Senate on May 21, 2013. Of course, as is often the case with the sausage-like business of legislating, challenges remain for the DATA Act. Unfortunately, amendments approved by the Senate Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee removed critical House-passed elements that are key to successful implementation of the law. To put it bluntly, the legislation will be neutered if the committee's version is enacted. The accountability platform provided in the bill, the current Recovery Board, is scheduled to cease operations in 2015. The bill, as introduced and passed by the House, included the continuation of the board, which would avoid reinventing the wheel to create a new oversight agency. The $20 million annual cost to run the Recovery Board would be more than offset by the billions saved from illuminating and eliminating waste. The excision of the accountability platform was also accompanied by the removal of one of the bill's key goals, to prevent waste, fraud, abuse, and improper payments. This declawing of the legislation is clearly self-defeating. As the DTC points out, without any internal government effort to use the newly standardized spending data for any purpose, there will be no internal pressure to improve the quality of data published on usaspending.gov. Hopefully, the integrity of the bill's enforcement provisions can be restored ahead of final Senate passage and ultimate enactment. For the legislation to achieve its goals, reporting agencies must understand first that their overseers are reviewing the data provided, thus necessitating its accuracy, and second, that consequences will accrue to those whose information is flawed. If these criteria are restored and signed into law, the DATA Act will be transformational. With regard to the Government Accountability and Transparency Board, we hope that this advisory board recognizes the merits of these efforts. We welcome the opportunity to collaborate, where appropriate, on achievement of the goals espoused herein. With that in mind, CAGW provides the following recommendations to the Board. Number 1, CAGW believes that it is critical that OMB set up a standard of terminology that is not to be strayed from for inputting data into usaspending.gov, and make those terms publicly available as search criteria for the database. Unless there are stringent rules relating to the terminology and positive enforcement of those rules, the website will continue to provide inconsistent results.
Specific funding obligations and actual spending levels of each program or purchased item should also be included in detail on the website.
Number 3, a link to whether the program or purchased item was funded through appropriations by the Senate or House, with a link to the authorizing language, appropriations bill, and administration request should also be included.
4, macro-level data, such as agency funding levels from year to year, would also provide better context.
And finally, number 5, synthesizing search results in a manner that is helpful to the user would provide the largest improvement. Currently, search terms return a disorganized list of information.
Clearly, additional information, such as risk assessments, could also be incorporated into usaspending.gov. However, again, it is critical for this information to be entered in a standard format, and reclassification of investments should be restrained. In December 2013, GAO issued a report on the IT dashboard, a tool used by agency CIOs to track the progress of IT programs across the government based on risk assessments rated as high, medium, or low. GAO found that the total number of investments reported by the agencies varied over time, in part due to varied classifications of investments, which impacts the number of investments receiving CIO ratings. For example, the Department of Energy reclassified several of its supercomputer investments from the IT category to a facilities classification. And the Department of Commerce reclassified its satellite ground systems investments, even though they were clearly IT investments.
Before concluding our presentation, we beg the Board's indulgence in remembering the John Godfrey Sachs poem, The Blind Men and the Elephant. The essence of this poem has been employed in discussion often, and I'm sure most, perhaps all of you, are familiar with its premise, which deals with an individual's narrow perspective. Sachs recounts the experience of 6 men from Indostan, each described as much inclined to learning, who went to see an elephant, though all of them were blind. Each blind man took his turn at observing the elephant. The first, who fell against the elephant's broad and sturdy side, inferred that the creature was very like a wall. The second happened on the tusk, exclaiming that the elephant was very like a spear. The third blind man took the squirming trunk in his hands and decided that the elephant was a snake, while the fourth felt the elephant's knee and determined that it was a tree. The fifth, who chanced to touch the ear, assumed that the elephant was a fan. The sixth and final blind man, seizing upon the elephant's tail, assumed that it was a rope. But the moral of Sachs's poem can be found in the final stanza, which reads like this. And so these men of Indostan disputed loud and long, each in his own opinion exceeding stiff and strong, though each was partly in the right, and all were in the wrong. The same can be said about information. If we cannot view the same object, particularly one that is as gargantuan as an elephant or the expenditures of the federal government, through the same lens, then we will inevitably miss the big picture. At the end of the day, this is a management issue, the proper management of monies provided by the American taxpayer. Regardless of whether the federal government is in surplus or deficit, there is no excuse for mismanaging the taxpayer's money. Better stewardship of the taxpayer's money should be the mantra of every member of Congress and every federal program administrator. With a little effort, current tools can help to meet this standard. We appreciate the opportunity to present our perspectives to the Board, and we would be glad to answer any questions.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Hudson Hollister from the Data Transparency Coalition.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be here. I'm particularly conscious. Is there a... Yes, there we go. Thank you. I'm particularly conscious of the effort that it takes across the government to align schedules and announcements for this board to meet together and to take comments from the public and from public interest organizations. And we're grateful for that. We look forward to more collaboration. Unfortunately, I won't be able to present a board show style the way the Citizens Against Government Waste did because I've got no presenting partner. But I hope that you'll nevertheless find my talk interesting. I'm Hudson Hollister. I represent the Data Transparency Coalition. We are, so far as I know, the only trade association that advocates for open data. We are technology and consulting companies that believe that governments should replace documents with data, should express public information as standardized data. I've listed our paying membership here. I'm sure you can get a copy of my presentation. But I think the thing to underscore is that all of the companies that have chosen to join the Data Transparency Coalition believe that government information can be a public resource if it's expressed as open data. We think that it's a win-win-win proposition for government, for citizens, and for industry if consistent data standards are adopted and if the information is consistently published. Joel Gurin, who served as President Obama's chief of the Smart Disclosure Task Force and now as an advisor to the NYU GovLab, has just published Open Data Now, where he says the value of government open data is that it's a long-term permanent resource that innovators can use for decades, developing new ideas and new companies as technology makes them possible. In his book, Joel, who I think many of you know, points out an example that is commonly used for open data, satellite location information. When President Reagan chose to make GPS data available to citizens in the 80s, I don't think that he was planning for smartphones. And yet, this morning, I used Apple Maps, which doesn't work quite as well as Google Maps. I used Apple Maps to find my way here to this strangely placed building. It goes to show that when decisions are made to release standardized machine-readable information to the public, the innovations might happen decades later. I hope not, but they might. But those decisions are crucial. Those decisions make people's lives better. Those decisions build our economy. We oversimplify the term open data compared with the open data policy released by President Obama, which I'll describe a bit later. But we really simplify it to two steps, the same two steps that Citizens Against Government Waste has mentioned. First, standardized. Second, published. We think both of these steps are crucial. The companies that are in the Data Transparency Coalition regard spending information as a public resource on which they can build businesses, but I think you'll understand that when I describe these business opportunities, they are a win-win for government and citizens as well as for the companies that hope to build them. First, democratic accountability. If federal spending information were standardized and published, then some of the companies that we work with, including Socrata, Poplicus, GovTribe, Bloomberg Government, could republish the spending information for citizens, make money off the advertising, republish it for the industry. Second, government management. Big data is a buzzword, analytics is a buzzword, but there's content behind those buzzwords. If we had consistently standardized, consistently published federal spending information, some of these companies could deploy sophisticated management and business analytics to improve value for taxpayers. Companies including Oracle, Teradata, Elder Research. And finally, one often overlooked benefit of the standardization and publication of government data is that once consistent standards are expressed, it's possible to automate compliance. In the 1990s, the IRS and the state tax agencies all got together to decide on a consistent XML schema for individual tax filings. That's what made TurboTax possible. We don't have that yet in federal grant and contract reporting. We could. The work of the Recovery Board shows the way forward for that innovation, because when the Recovery Board established a 97-element XML schema, was it 97? It was 97. 97 elements for reports by grantees and contractors in the stimulus, the private sector developed tools that handled the reporting automatically, dramatically reducing the burden for states, universities, and other grantees of reporting simultaneously similar information from the same ERP to 28 different agencies. Companies including Web Filing, Streamlink Software, and Level 1 Technologies are eager to get to work on automating compliance for federal grantees and contractors if we get data standards, if we get publication. We don't have that today. Let's talk about the current landscape. This is an oversimplified list, but it makes me think of the blind men disputing loud and long over the elephant. Congress in its wisdom has imposed a miasma of reporting requirements across the federal government over the years. Agencies report their financial close information to the Fiscal Service at the Treasury Department. Agencies report, they submit payment requests to Treasury. Not all the time. DoD has separate payment authority, but about 80% of the time. Budget planning and actions are reported by the agencies to OMB. Grants are reported by the agencies to Commerce. Contracts by the agencies to GSA. Meanwhile, there are separate awardee reporting requirements. Grantees and contractors must report to whatever agency gave them the funds. They must also submit some reports to GSA if they are contractors. There's a subaward reporting requirement, which anecdotal evidence suggests is not much enforced. Awardees must report to the FSRS, for which OMB is responsible. And finally, under the Government Performance Results Act and the Government Performance and Results Act, Modernization Act, agencies must report to Congress and OMB on a program-by-program basis their performance planning and their performance results. All of these separate reporting regimes are essential if we are to get a handle on federal spending. It's impossible today to pull up a particular federal contractor and see all of the payments that contractor has received from different agencies, to pull up a listing for a particular federal program and see both its external expending on grants and contracts and also its internal spending on things like salaries. It's impossible to trace the life cycle of federal spending from congressional appropriation through allocation, through obligation, through expenditure, award, subaward. All of those things should be possible. We believe that they all would be possible with proper standardization and publication. There's an interlocking set of problems that comes from these separate silos that I just described. First, information frequently is not available. The different stakeholders, the many different stakeholders, frequently don't have access to the data that they need to make decisions. The public, Congress, Treasury, OMB, agency leaders, inspectors general, even the program managers who are in charge of the programs frequently can't get granular payment information, even though that information could be recovered in response to a Freedom of Information Act request. Second, even when information is available, it's often not accessible. It's available, but only as documents or summaries. Information technology means that we shouldn't have to summarize anything anymore. The public information should be available, and users should be free to aggregate it however they see fit. There is less need for statistics and less need for summaries than there ever has been before. Finally, even where information is accessible and available, it's often not interoperable. We don't have even basic government-wide data standards for federal spending information. We don't have an agreed agency identifier. When I worked on Capitol Hill, I asked the Congressional Research Service, OMB, and the Government Accountability Office how many federal agencies we had, and I got 3 different answers. Without a machine-readable set of identifiers for a concept as basic as government agency, of which we've got fewer than 200, anybody want to venture a guess? Is there an official list? I don't think that there is. We've got fewer than 200, more than 100, I think. But it goes beyond, of course, that basic concept of agency. There ought to be government-wide identifiers for program appropriations line item. Got to get the appropriations committees interested there. For grantees, contractors, grants, contracts, those things don't exist. And they need to be government-wide. And this is an important point. Unless there is a government-wide system of identifiers in each of those cases, then we won't be able to get the enterprise-wide view that the administration, Congress, and citizens all need and deserve. The technology exists. I'd point out specifically the Treasury Department's efforts to establish the legal entity identifier in financial regulation. The infrastructure is already being built and already exists for all the financial regulators to use the same ID code for all of the entities that submit reports to the financial regulators. The LEI was built to move beyond financial regulation. Our coalition believes it should be used in federal spending as well. Imagine the interoperability we could have if this infrastructure that already exists, already being built, were used to identify grantees and contractors across the government. When President Obama issued the open data policy last May, he recognized the need for data standards. The open data policy asks all agencies to move their inaccessible, disconnected public documents into open data, to transform them, and it defines open data. There are 7 characteristics the President cited. Government open data, I should have put them on the slide, but I did not, but you can look it up. Public, accessible, described, reusable, complete, timely, and managed post-release. All 7 of those characteristics require that consistent data standards be adopted, and they require government-wide publication mandates. How do we move toward that future? Well, I think we've got a great deal of policy work to build on. We've got a very good start. First, I'd point back to this very board's recommendations from December 2011. Those are exactly the right recommendations. A government-wide accountability framework, a consolidation of grant and contract data collection, and at least one of those consistent government-wide identifiers that we need so desperately. Those were the right recommendations. They have not yet been implemented. To this board's credit, I think it's going to continue to mention those recommendations and continue to work toward them until they are. The open data policy should be applied to spending. A couple of the concrete steps toward that I can mention. When President Obama issued the open data policy, he asked each agency to prepare and to publish an inventory of all of its public data. Those inventories were first published in November. Now, President Obama and the Office of Science and Technology Policy made it clear the inventories that are to be published under the open data policy must be comprehensive. They've got to include all public data. Now, that's a very tall order, and it'll take time to move those inventories to comprehensiveness. But I think this board could insist that those inventories include spending data. They include all of the repositories that relate to what the government is spending, because as we've said many times, spending is what's for dinner. It's really the most important data that our government exchanges and generates. That would be a great place for those inventories to start. Now, this board has made the right recommendations, and the open data policy has prescribed the right criteria. However, our coalition feels legislation will be necessary to fully implement this board's recommendations and to fully apply the principles of the open data policy to spending. That's why we support the Digital Accountability and Transparency Act. I'm always, whenever I present on this law, this proposal, I'm always a little bit embarrassed that if you spell it out, it's Digital Accountability and Transparency Act. We'll never be able to fix that. Despite that shortcoming, we believe that the impacts I described earlier will be brought about by the Data Act. The Data Act is a broad mandate for government-wide data standards across all federal spending and for the publication of that whole corpus online. The desired impacts, I'm listing them here, they'll take years to reach, but the Data Act imposes those fundamental principles that are necessary to get there. We've got to be aiming for something when we try to transform federal spending. As Comptroller General Gene Dodaro testified last summer, without legislation, it isn't going to happen. Our coalition firmly believes that. The status, actually, this slide has changed since I wrote this presentation for the originally scheduled meeting on January 22nd. We still expect that the Senate's going to pass the Data Act. We know that the Senate sponsors are working on a version for which they'll seek unanimous consent. I'd be happy to take the questions of this board, and we appreciate the opportunity to provide the industry's perspective. Thank you. Mr. Williams.
Hello, Hudson. I'm so glad you were here today. The sixth goal that you talked about, the sixth goal of the White House, is managed publication.
That's number 7.
7. Can you elaborate on what you imagine?
Yeah, that's right. President Obama's last criteria for what open data is for the data to be managed post-release. And I think that means that data sets shouldn't just be tossed out to the public. They've got to remain accurate. We can cite a couple of examples in spending. Using usaspending.gov, it's clear that some management has taken place. That's a good thing. For instance, the first time I searched through all of the Department of Housing and Urban Development's grants for the top 100 recipients, New York City's Public Housing Authority, spelled 4 different ways, appeared 4 different times. That problem's no longer there. That means someone is doing their job. I think that principle the President cited also means that the managers of the public platform must regularly seek public input, because I'll bet that the managers of usaspending.gov didn't find that problem on their own. They saw it published in blogs by the Sunlight Foundation. They saw the complaints of people trying to use that data. That's another aspect of it. Thank you. Yes.
Speak into the mic. Use the mic.
Use the mic. I'm using the mic. Could you tell me a little bit more about the legal entity identifier that you mentioned that financial regulators use?
Yes. When Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act of 2010, the law set up the Office of Financial Research within the Department of the Treasury. The Office of Financial Research has the authority to issue rules that require all the financial regulators, at least all of the, we've got an alphabet soup of financial regulators compared to most of the world. Most countries have 2. I don't know how many we have, identifiers. The Congress gave the OFR the authority to issue rules requiring all the U.S. financial regulators to adopt consistent standards, including common identifiers, for the information they collect. The OFR is the point agency in the United States that is a delegate to the Global Financial Stability Board, which the G20 agreed to set up in the wake of the crisis. The Financial Stability Board is working to set up this global infrastructure for the LEI. Here's how it works. They set up a central utility in Switzerland that seeks to manage the identifier globally, and agencies in each country can apply to be local operating units, or LOUs. That gives them the authority to issue LEIs. And it's all managed by the central operating unit. There's a prefix in the number that says which of the local operating units issued the number. Within the United States, the CFTC is going to be one of those local operating units and has already begun issuing a preliminary version of the identifier for participants in swap markets. The interesting and I think crucial point is that you don't have to be a financial regulator to be a local operating unit. The future that our coalition hopes to see is that perhaps the GSA, perhaps Treasury, perhaps OMB will become a local operating unit for the purpose of issuing the identifier to grantees and contractors. The LEI is intended, one of the big differences between the LEI and the existing DUNS number, besides the fact that it won't be proprietary, there will be no need for a big red disclaimer on usaspending.gov. The LEI is intended to reflect the hierarchy of entities. That means we'll get beyond one of the problems that bedevils usaspending.gov. If you look for the city of Los Angeles and all of its many different subdivisions, there's no way to see the mapping of the city of Los Angeles Bureau of Public Works Water Authority. The LEI has a field, although it's really simple and intended to be applied beyond financial regulation, the LEI has a field that allows the entity to identify its immediate parent and its ultimate parent, which means that all of those trees of authority, ownership, and management can be mapped out. Thanks.
Your slide said automated compliance, grantees and contractors report without strain. One, I'm not sure.
Without any strain.
Yeah, I'm not sure they report without strain. Do you see a distinction between grants and contracts? In the contract world, they give us an invoice and we make a payment, and we can report the repayment. What's the advantage of having them report versus us saying we wrote the check?
That's a very good question, Mr. Chairman. I think in both the grant and contract world, there is I think actually more in the contract world than the grant world. There are frequent data calls from the government to contractors. We'd like to have this information, we'd like to have that information, and we're entitled to it as a party to the contract. I've spoken with Tech America and other representatives of federal contractors, and that significantly for them increases the cost of being a government contractor, which in turn drives up contracting costs. Over on the grant side, you'll hear later today from Cornelia Chebanu from the National Association of State Comptrollers and Treasurers, who will explain the burdens that states, as recipients of about 60% of federal grant funds, bear by having to report similar information to many different agencies. I think those problems are somewhat different when you compare the contract world and the grant world, because in the contract world we have these data calls, we've got all those reporting obligations to the GSA. In the grant world, there is a standard form, and the reporting is somewhat simpler, but it must flow to many different agencies, and grantees usually aren't as well resourced as contractors. In both cases, common data formats and common data elements, certainly not for the whole vast structure of federal grant making or federal contracting, but for the basic stuff, would allow some of the companies that we work with to build platforms that automatically pull the information from the contractor or the grantee's ERP. I hope that's helpful. It's a bit wide-ranging. Other questions? Thank you.
So thank you for saying Cornelia's name. Our next speaker is Cornelia Chebanu. I hopefully I've said that correctly. From the National Association of State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers.
Thank you for the shout out, Hudson. Always good to have that. Good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to share with you our views on federal data transparency. I'd like to give a special shout out to Nancy DiPaolo. We worked closely with Nancy on Recovery Act implementation, and she never forgets her state level counterpart. So thank you, Nancy, for reaching out to us and making sure that we came here to express our views. My name is Cornelia Chebanu, as you've heard, and I serve as the Washington Director for the National Association of State Auditors, Comptrollers, and Treasurers. Our organization represents both elected and appointed state financial officials with the role of auditor, comptroller, and treasurer in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories. Our members are the officials who deal with financial management at the state level of government. Like the federal government, however, we recognize the need to provide data to the public that is both accurate and informative. Our perspectives today come from both the state auditors who use federal data in conducting their audits, and also from state comptrollers who run the state's financial system and are in many cases responsible for providing financial information on federal awards and for setting policies and serving in an oversight role for the state agencies who receive the federal awards. Much of our perspective is also comes from our members' work on implementing the Recovery Act. I should caution, however, that each state is unique, and the roles of our members and their involvement in the grants process varies widely. First and foremost, we are extremely pleased that you have decided to hear from stakeholders, and we hope that you will continue this dialogue as you move forward in achieving your goals. Ongoing input and consultation are so important for developing policies and tools that are effective, which in turn assists in keeping the public trust, and that's important for us as state-level governments as it is for the federal government. As many of you may be aware, we had a lot of collaboration occurred during Recovery Act, and that was paramount, we think, to the successful implementation. Weekly phone calls, very open on behalf of the federal government, OMB, GAO, and the Recovery Board were all on those calls, and I think it was paramount to the successful delivery of those programs. We strongly believe that informed effort can contribute to the likelihood of a successful endeavor. So I can't stress enough these types of meetings and ongoing collaboration and how important that is. We suggest that the GAPI follow a similar approach to collaboration that was employed during the Recovery Act, and that's by, 1, soliciting ongoing feedback from your state and local partners when you formulate and revise rules and policies that govern transparency of federal funds, and 2, by responding to questions in an ongoing manner from those that will have to implement and or follow your new and implemented rules and policies. We recognize you have a hard task of trying to meet the desires of all the stakeholders while still weighing the costs and benefits of providing information in a manner that is understandable, accurate, and publicly available. Data reporting standardization should keep in mind that costs and burdens are not only on the federal government, but also on federal grant recipients. As many of you know, serving in the IG capacity, transparency, accountability, minimization of fraud, waste, and abuse are not new concepts for you all, or they are for our members. These concepts are the foundation of the work they conduct each day as public servants. With interest, we have read through your Way Forward document. In your document, you state that there are 3 audiences for federal spending information: federal agencies doing the spending, the federal overseers who protect against waste, fraud, and abuse, and the American public. We believe also that state and local oversight professionals and the recipients are also part of an audience that uses this important information. We are also very pleased to see that you are working towards a universal identifier for federal awards. This is a frustration of users, and that there are many ways to identify an award. Currently, there are numerous identifiers, all for varying purposes, including the FAIN, the DUNS number, the CFDA, the Treasury account symbol, and those are just to name a few. The DUNS number has been specifically problematic for state governments. Although that was intended to be, I think, a universal identifier, I'm not sure that it served its purpose. Also, during Recovery Act implementation, guidance required the use of Treasury account symbols. However, this was a new concept for some recipients who were unaware of what that number even was. Therefore, movement towards providing a unique identifier is a very welcomed effort, and I hope you continue to pursue down that path. Also, in your notice for this meeting, you specifically asked who we represent. As mentioned earlier, we represent state financial officials, both the auditor and the comptroller, and treasurer as well, but for purposes of this meeting, the auditor and comptroller. Many of our auditor members are currently utilizing the recovery.gov website for compliance testing in their single audits. And as more and more audit shops continue to do performance audits, we think this information will be similarly as important. As state auditors conduct single audits of subrecipients, accurate and timely grant information that is available on a public website will serve as a valuable source of independent corroboration. If this information is readily accessible online, it will prevent auditors from having to spend costly time confirming the amount of grants received from various grantor agencies. When you audit many different entities like our auditors do, the amount of time spent on this fundamental audit step can really add up. Also, having grant information online will assist auditors in monitoring subrecipients. Our members look forward to increasing their use of the federal data as part of their single audit testing. However, we believe information is only as good as its accuracy, so our one recommendation would be that data integrity be an important consideration as you set transparency policy. Moving from the audit now a little bit to the comptroller side, as a prime recipient or as an overseer of those prime recipients, we seek federal information such as how much federal assistance was awarded, how much was actually received, and ultimately how much federal assistance was expended. A clear, consistent meaning of every data element is key. Currently, the information available is inconsistent, which therefore introduces unreliability. More consistency would allow the data to be used for multiple comparative purposes. Eric Brenner of the Maryland Governor's Office, who is here today, will speak a moment about how he uses data for comparison purposes in his state. The lack of consistent data and standards and the commonality of how data elements are defined places an undue burden on federal fund recipients. This can result in them having to report the same information numerous times via disparate reporting platforms, as Hudson mentioned. Federal spending enhancements should be made by centralizing the source of guidance and oversight for all recipient reporting. Guidance from a central agency should not be left open for interpretation by other agencies. A very big frustration we faced during the Recovery Act was when agencies would issue their own guidance that was in direct conflict with that issued by OMB. Programmatic specific guidance should not be issued for reporting data elements by multiple federal agencies. For example, the term expended. This has been interpreted in various ways depending on the source. Some federal guidance documents interpret funds expended when the activity related to the award occurs. Other federal agencies may not consider funds expended if the funds have not been drawn down from the federal agency. Still yet, other agencies may interpret funds expended only at the time when the cash is actually dispersed by the recipient. The stability and consistency with the annual reporting of the schedule of expenditures of federal awards as required by A133, OMB Circular A133, that stems from the fact that only one agency issues the requirements and guidelines, even though many federal agencies may contribute to the content. We believe that eliminating redundant reporting requirements that are already mandated and maintaining only one body of information would curb confusion when trying to form summations of federal spending data, which may be reported in multiple places, again, as Hudson mentioned. Collecting data for multiple reports under various terms results in unnecessary duplication of effort. Any reporting of performance measures, we believe, should be linked to payment data by adding those major action elements to the same reporting model that contains the spending data. We would also suggest that you focus the reporting of recipients on funds expended for goods and services. The average citizen likely just wants to know who received the tax dollars and has no idea of the difference between subaward, procurement, subrecipient, or vendor. In addition, accounting and financial systems do not track payees by recipient type in many cases. This is an unnecessary burden, particularly for small prime recipients, and most likely has no meaning to your average citizen. Keep it simple and look at who received the federal dollars. We believe this will promote accuracy and efficiency by removing the manual efforts that are necessary to extract disbursement data and specifically categorizing the different types of payees. In closing, I would like to ask that the board consider sharing some of the tools that were developed by the Recovery Operations Center, with those state and local oversight professionals. As you know, the ROC served as a centralized location for analyzing Recovery Act funds and their recipients through the use of predictive analytic technologies. ROC analysts would cross-reference lists of grant recipients or subrecipients against various variety of databases to look for risk indicators such as criminal convictions, lawsuits, tax liens, bankruptcies, risky financial deals, or suspension and disbarment proceedings. These tools, we believe, would be extremely helpful to state auditors that audit federal funds, as they share in the federal government's concern for reducing and identifying instances of waste, fraud, and abuse. And we would welcome opportunities to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of their audits. Fraud, abuse, and risk identification are some of the main purposes of the required recipient single audits, and therefore sharing of those tools would certainly be beneficial for our members. In closing, I want to thank you very much for this opportunity to be involved in your process as you move forward. We're following your work closely, and we look forward to providing you with some useful input as you progress further on your journey. Thank you for your time.
Cornelia, in addition to reporting,
I'm already sorry I asked this.
I am too.
In addition to reporting, what kinds of coordination occurred then that you would like to see now? What were the nature of the conversations to coordinate?
A lot of the coordination had to do at that time during Recovery Act with actually developing the guidance, because the guidance that was developed by OMB for the federal agencies had a major effect on those folks that would report. And then likewise, when we worked with the Recovery Board, there were some instances of DUNS numbers being required and the way people would actually have to register to have access for the reporting that were very problematic, that we were able to point out early on before the system got too far down the road. So I think it was important. But for Recovery Act purposes, it was mostly, I would say, reporting. However, we have an ongoing relationship with OMB, and they've been very open in the grant management reform efforts to hearing our input on their various policies. And we're always happy on behalf of the federal government, if you guys want to poll our members in terms of if you're trying to do something in terms of audit or even reporting to see how that might affect us, we're always welcome to do that.
So our next speaker is David Quam from the National Governors Association.
Good morning. Thank you for having us here. My name is David Quam. I'm with the National Governors Association. We represent the governors of the states, the commonwealths, and the territories. It's a pleasure to be here because governors were front and center during the Recovery Act, experienced what it was like to put that together, so we're happy to share those lessons. I am going to probably be short. I'm not the detail guy. Cornelia and NASAC were absolutely invaluable partners in getting us through this. And so I'm going to take everything Cornelia said and say ditto. Because from a state perspective, that level of detail and the folks who had to implement, it is amazing what we found as the gaps between the federal government and state government. And when you had to actually integrate these systems, the bridges that had to be built, the problems that were found, how do you get recipients to report to a system that is unfamiliar, not transparent, and hard to break into, was everything that we were dealing with in the Recovery Act. I also have to give a shout out to Nancy, who I'm going to the question that was just asked on collaboration. And I want to emphasize a point that maybe won't come up. There is a customer service angle to this as you move ahead with regard to recipient reporting and with regard to all the information that has to come from states. If you don't have a connection to the customer and the recipient that allows for that management back and forth and that collaboration on the implementation side, you will never get the data that you need, expect, or want. It won't be accurate. And that goes to, I think, even we were talking about the President's Goal number 7, managing the data afterwards. Absolutely critical that you can take a look at it, you can revise it to make sure it's accurate. Accuracy was key. And so that customer service angle on the backside can never be forgotten when you're putting these systems together. I'm going to back up and give a broader view of where we were, how we got here, and then sort of from the governor's perspective, where we're going. I'm fortunate to be followed by Eric Brenner from Maryland, who again is the detail guy. They are the ones who made this work. Governors oversaw it, but the auditors, comptrollers, and treasurers, the grant folks, they're the ones who really did the nitty-gritty. So I very much encourage you to really listen to what they have to say, because from the recipient community, they're going to have probably the most productive recommendations you can give. Let's go all the way back. President Obama comes into office, he meets with the nation's governors. We're on the verge of a recession. Recovery Act has not been born yet. Governors meet with the president, and they have a discussion on what this needs to look like. What they agree to is the following. Number one, if there's going to be all this money coming through, first, spend it through existing lines. Don't build something new. Let's use what we have to get this money out quickly. Number two, governors say, hold us accountable. Let's track every dollar. We're good with that. If we get the money, we'll tell you where it's spent, we'll report back to you, and let's find out, because the American taxpayer really is going to need to know where these Recovery Act dollars go. And finally, if we don't use it, we'll give it back. The use it or lose it. That was the concept that became the Recovery Act, at least from a state perspective and state-federal perspective, as we move forward. Those core elements became the reporting regime that followed the Recovery Act. I think it's important to know from which we came. Your next question, how do we use it? Governors used that information and the reporting that they did to manage. Governors are users of this information. They need data to make key policy decisions, investment decisions, ferret out waste, fraud, and abuse. Where did the money go? Do we have to invest someplace else? Are we treating everybody in the state fairly? That's invaluable information to a governor, just like it is to the head of an agency or the President of the United States. And so there's a usefulness to this information when it comes out. But there are some key elements, and you all know this very, very well. The information has to be accurate. It has to be timely. It has to be relevant. And it has to be accessible. You put all of those into a system, and you have a system that works. But every recommendation I think you're going to hear from today falls into one of those categories. Is it accessible? Can you actually get there? Can you use it? Is it relevant? Is this information that was actually necessary? Is it timely? Is this real-time information that's going to allow us to make the best decision, or governor the best decision at the right time? And again, is it accurate? Are we working with information that's actually true? You put all those elements together and you have a system that works. Now, I'm going to skip all the way to your last question, which was when we talk about enhancements. And I get to do this from the 40,000-foot level. Again, I don't have to be the detail guy. It's great. But from the 40,000-foot level, there are three key lessons that we really learned. And I'm going to couch them this way. Number one is going to be build the plane, and I'll explain that. Number two is Steve Jobs was right. I'll explain that too. And the third one is the advice I got from my dad when buying a car. All of these are going to be relevant to when you build this system. The first one, building the plane. Early on, the president and the vice president brought all of the recovery czars together. And one of the agency heads, and I wish I could remember who it was, got up on stage, closed door, and said, "Folks, we're going to build the plane as we fly it." Well, that was terrifying, but it was also true. Translate that into collaboration. What this became was a day-to-day, week-to-week collaboration about the rules, the guidance, the needs, and the gaps. I have never seen in all my years in Washington, D.C., the level of collaboration that we have between states, OMB, and this board. Because we had to build the airplane as we were flying it. And so we were in a crisis mode. We had to work quickly. We had to be accurate. But if we can recapture not the crisis part, but at least the intent, that level of collaboration is what made this successful. And that's where I go all the way back to not only on the front side, but on the back side, where you have to have the customer service with the recipients. You have to have points of contact that are reliable and knowledgeable. And you have to have somebody who's going to be on the other end of the phone when you're doing reporting that you can trust, and that if you have a problem, we'll work it out. If you don't, becomes a system that's not useful. Second one, Steve Jobs was right. There's a great story about Steve Jobs, and there's so many of them, but the one that stuck with me was an article I read where he wanted an interface so that you could copy the video you take on your phone into the iMovies program on your computer. And so his team apparently came together, and some of the best engineers in the world, and they did this interface, and they put it up on a screen, and they had the play button, the record button, and the transfer button, and everything you would think you would need. And Jobs came in and saw this, and he's like, "That's ridiculous." He erases the whiteboard, draws a stick figure on one side, a circle on the other, and draws a line between the two of them. Said, "This is what I want. Copy." And everybody in the room who had been working for 6 months on that interface knew he was right. Keep it simple. Simplicity is everything that you've heard today. Common definitions. A nut and a bolt at the Department of Defense is a nut and a bolt at the Department of Transportation is a nut and a bolt at the Department of Labor. If it's not, you're not simplified. A report that requires the same information between agencies should only have to be filled out once. And that information should be allowed to be shared. We're not there yet, but that's where we need to be. We need to be in that simple move it from the left to the right. In the Recovery Act, and we had this conversation over and over and over again, it was about pre-filling some of the key data elements, the stuff that information states did not have that the federal government already had. Well, if the federal government could put that into the form, how much time and effort did you just save the states? How much money did you just save the states? How many hours did you just save the states? How much accuracy did you just ensure, because now the information is consistent between the teams? That is simplicity. Steve Jobs got it right. The final one is the advice my dad gave me when buying a car. And I think we've heard this. It's an old saying that I've heard before. I credited my dad at the time. He stole it from somebody else. And that is, you buy as much house as you can afford, you buy as much car as you need. Key difference. When building these systems, especially when we have the distance that we have to go, and because you are talking about some of your key recipients being states, cost matters. Every additional detail is a mandate or cost on states where we are spending time reporting to the federal government rather than doing the business of government. That is a key factor. Build the system and ask for the information you need. The biggest fight I got into with a state agency during the Recovery Act was for the quarterly reports. They thought of a dozen other metrics they would just like to have on how that program was working. And this is stuff they had been looking for years. This would be great if we had this information. Now we have to make you report, so why don't we just add these elements? And we stood up and said, no! The Recovery Act calls for this. We're tracking the dollars. We're tracking the programs. This is what you need. You don't get what you want. If we start with the need, and there's so much need, there's a need for simplicity, for streamlining, for bringing this together so that everybody has, again, information that is accurate, timely, reliable, and accessible, and relevant, We need to focus on what is needed, get the baseline done, worry about what everybody wants after that. And when we get to the want, that's where the collaboration comes back in. You have to make sure it works between the levels of government. For states, states are recovering, but they have not yet recovered. States could not spend and had to divest from key programs, whether it's education, prisons, public safety, and just now we're getting back to 2008 levels. So we've turned a corner and we're doing better. To take that money and then spend it here when you don't have to, rather than reinvesting in those programs, doesn't make a lot of sense. But putting systems in place and building on the success that we enjoyed in the Recovery Act does make sense. Actually, it would be a shame to lose the lessons we learned and not move forward. The Data Act is a strong step forward. We had tried to work to make sure that the lessons from the state level were incorporated there. But you know what? The federal shop has to get its house in order first. Until we break down those silos, until the simplicity is there, you cannot build a bridge back to the states. The states, in turn, there will be a domino effect to bring this along, but it's got to be done in collaboration so that we're not unnecessarily spending money we don't have to or collecting information that we don't need. If we do that, we can be successful moving forward. So those were a couple of just key lessons that governors learned. They were very proud of what they accomplished. So it's funny, for all the hoopla that the Recovery Act got, the success story happened to be this. The money was spent. It wasn't wasted. We know where it went. There was no waste, fraud, and abuse. Those numbers are remarkable. I know the Vice President talks about it all the time, and he's right. And governors were a key part of that. It wasn't partisan. It was about getting it done. Those success stories, I think, can really help guide us as we move forward. Again, encourage you to listen to the details from the folks who really know the nitty-gritty. That's going to be important as we move forward. But I think some of these key elements, if they are the guiding principles, will help bring everybody together and probably are going to run through every presentation you hear this morning. So thank you for your time. I appreciate being here.
I think you're right that there are themes and threads that run through these, but it also seems to me that we have a lot of great recommendations, but there's never been an effort to integrate those and validate those into a single list, and that might be an important thing that we or someone could do with you.
We would welcome that opportunity. I think what you have here as I'm listening is different audiences. And different audiences have different needs. As the states were unique, 26% of the money that states spend is actually federal dollars. On average, 26% of state budgets come from the federal government. That means they are recipients. They're going to do a lot of reporting. This is a key element to making this system work. We would be happy to work with you on that list. And again, getting down to, I think the key is the want or the need, not the want, and making that happen. And then some of the bells and whistles can come later once we get it right. But I'd be happy to work with you on this list. I'm sure the states, we could organize several groups. Eric Brenner will be up there talking about some of the folks he already works with. NASDAQ would be critical in that as well. The team that was on the Recovery Act would be the place to start. Thank you.
So our next speaker is Mr. Eric Brenner from the Maryland Governor's Grants Office.
All right, thank you. The most important thing I learned already is I can't wait to see what kind of car David Quam drives. All right, my name's Eric Brenner, Director of the Maryland Governor's Grants Office, and we're currently in the process of preparing what for us is our 11th annual report, which is where we gather information on all federal grants received by Maryland state government. We put it in a single location, and it's used by our elected officials, nonprofits, members of the public. So last year we had 472 federal grants, $9.3 billion, and as David sort of hinted at, it's a third of our budget. It's a lot of money that's coming in. And this information, this annual report, serves as it's a primary research tool that our local governments use, our nonprofits, individuals interested in accessing public funds, and it includes very specific details on where these federal grants come from, how they're distributed, and which state policy goals were advanced from the receipt of those funds. Maryland does not have a statewide grants management system, and to the best of my knowledge, no state does, with Massachusetts being the closest to actually implementing one. So the process of building this annual report, it involves taking initial data estimates from our state Department of Budget and Management. We share these with about 25 state agency grants contacts. They in turn write reports on the grants received, and these are the building blocks for the whole report. It takes about 3 months from beginning to end. And the irony here is it's only accurate, 100% accurate, on the day it is finished, and we put the PDF to it. So then it starts to deteriorate over the year till we build it again. Other states that either have a grants office or they're considering creating an office, they always ask us if it's possible to short-circuit the process, go directly to USA Spending and get that grants data. And unfortunately, the answer is still no. And until that kind of information is readily available and usable, any further discussion on the many positive financial and policy benefits from transparency really seems just a little bit premature. So the states either have a grants office or have the remains of their recovery office doing something like what we do. We speak on a pretty regular basis on conference calls. And Laurie Petrone from Rhode Island and Ramesh Advani from Massachusetts submitted pretty detailed responses to the 6 questions that you posed. And what I'm about to do is kind of paraphrase their remarks. I've added some of my own. And while this isn't an official statement on behalf of all the states, I'm pretty sure that the views I'm going to give are reflected by all the people that participate in these calls. You've heard some of the remarks already from earlier speakers. And while it's a bit dry, let me at least walk through the 6 questions you were good enough to ask, and you've earned the right to 6 specific sets of answers. So here goes. Your first question was, what questions are you trying to answer with federal spending information? And the first obvious one is we want to know the amount of federal funds currently available in all state agencies, broken out by individual grant awards. We want to know what the fiscal and programmatic start and end dates are for each federal grant award. The third point, how much of an award has been spent, is committed, and how much remains to be drawn down from each award. Fourth point is what is the state match required, if any, and that includes in kind, and are there other non-federal match requirements out there? Fifth point is can information be identified at the subrecipient and prime vendor or sub-vendor level? Sixth point, are grants awards, are they mandatory or discretionary, and are they continuing or one-time awards? Next point is there additional information on the programs or the sectors where the dollars are being spent, policy types of things? And then finally, is there information on other grant opportunities where applications have been submitted, they're already in the system, but decisions or awards have not yet been made? Your second question, what federal spending information do you need to answer these questions? The first, again, to repeat, is that individual award level data by state, including state government agency, need the prime recipient name, CFDA, or an award number, all in an easy-to-search system. Second point, local government grant recipients, both direct and as subrecipients, and the same for nonprofits, for higher education institutions, again, in an easy-to-search system. And third, the award history of each grant, including start and end dates, amendments, and no-cost extensions. Your next question is, where do you find that federal spending information now? And this really was a good question. The state sources that we use, it's a combination of award letters, state budget office data, grants contacts in state agencies, but it's all mostly manual activities. We wish there was a state financial system set up. Again, we're waiting on Massachusetts to kind of be the first. I think a lot of the feds are surprised that we don't. For what might seem to you like small budget figures, it's a lot of money for us. So for someone to actually say we're going to spend a few $1 million on this was a big deal. We're all hoping Massachusetts succeeds. USAspending.gov, it's used for only the most anecdotal purposes. It's just not trusted for broader searches when more accurate, comprehensive information is required. Federal funds information for states, FFIS, is widely used by state governments for large federal grants, and they're increasingly building other grants into their database. CFDA and SAM used to identify basic characteristics like competitive versus formula, and then grants.gov, recovery.gov, individual federal agency websites, contacts, and even Congressional Research Service, all used on occasion for varying things. And the last point here, U.S. Census Bureau used to produce the CFFR reports. They no longer do that, which included federal funding information for local governments. I always used to bellyache that they were slow. They're very accurate, but they were slow, and now they're gone completely, so I probably should have been nicer back at the time. Your next question, where does federal spending information need clear instructions or explanations? First point, award letters really should have a standardized format, and I think most federal agencies, they now differ a bit, and award numbers also should be standardized. On the positive side, data dictionaries and user guides that support FFADA reporting, USA Spending, and recovery.gov, they're all helpful, but it really would be more efficient to have a standard template for all reports. With the broader point, sort of redundantly being that without the data standardization at the front end, all the data gathering tools and databases for Prime and Sub and everybody else, it's just always going to be difficult to use. And then your final question was, what suggestions do you have for prioritizing federal spending information enhancements? Again, everything you've heard before, but I'll put it in the 3 points. Standardization of data elements and a common data dictionary for all federal grants, preferably modeled on the Recovery Act learnings and approach. Second point is a common federal grant database and reporting systems that all prime recipients use to submit spending information, and that includes all federal agencies being required to use these, instead of just saying, yeah, we'll make these guys happy, but we're still going to use our own system. I think that kind of undermines the effort you're trying to get at. And then the final point is allow the states that are trying to develop standardized enterprise-wide grants management systems to centrally access these federal systems for information submitted by their state agencies. I know Massachusetts would like to do this. We've done very small experiments with our state contacts where we'll say, take 30 minutes, go off to a computer, go to USA Spending, and see if you can track information on a grant you know you're managing. And in almost every case, they can't do it or they come back with something less than perfect. So that covers the main 6 questions you asked. I want to go to a couple examples, really from the last couple weeks of work on why these issues are important for the constituents that we deal with on a daily basis. So I mentioned the discontinuation of the census reports from CFFR before USA Spending was kind of up to speed. And that really came home about 2 weeks ago. We have a 90-day legislative session. We do a briefing for legislative staff on the first day, mostly how do you help constituents find money. But we buried in our report, we still have that old CFFR number where dollars are broken out by county. And it's incredibly popular, even though I think the date is 4 years old. They want to see where the money's coming into their county to help constituents. They also want to see what the next county's doing, right? Where those grants from agriculture come from. Why didn't we get them? So this year, I think we're finally going to drop it. And we are putting in, and I'm bad-mouthing USA Spending, but we're putting in the effort. There's a lot of information in there. A lot of people worked hard to put it in. And I think we're going to go into it, rip it apart, zip code +4, try to put that into our counties, and it'll be a better-than-nothing solution. It won't be comprehensive, and we won't pretend that it is. But I think after 4 years, we at least owe the effort to see how we can do on that. So we're working on that over the next couple of weeks. Congressional staff and staff to all elected officials, they always do briefings for their bosses, and pretty basic information is, Congressman A is going to Hagerstown, wants to see what are the biggest federal grants and contracts, what are the most recent ones coming in there. And just providing that basic level of briefing information is still really difficult. A lot of these folks have tried USA spending once or twice. They rarely go back. And Hudson, if Hudson had any dead members, they would roll over in their grave because there are hard copy file folders sitting in congressional offices of press releases on grant notices. And the guy, who I won't name, said, at least I got something to put in there. But I know it's not comprehensive. But I'm at least going to tell them, the fact that Justice still cranks out these press releases, I'm using them. So, these files should have been shredded years ago. They're still actually being used. The Recovery Act website, in a strange way, exacerbated the problems because people expected this level of quality going forward. So to actually see that it was possible for a real-time map-based website that constituents could use, you didn't need me or Norm or Hudson to interpret this. You could actually say, go to the site, tell me what you think. And to have taken a step back, it's getting increasingly difficult to explain why this isn't being done for all the funds. So even in the heyday of the Recovery Act, maybe 15% of the federal funds were on there. So they'd always ask, well, what about the other 85? But at least you could see what was out there and get started. Now, as recovery drifts back to a single-digit percentage, and that's probably a little bit behind the reason for the hearing and why I think we're making some progress. So, this last point here, seeing Norm and OMB in the front of the room, there's a lot of good work being done on grants management improvements, and I think the states really are enjoying the partnership that we're working with the feds and local governments on. But for really effective grants management improvements, what we need most right now from the federal government is to strengthen the foundation that we have been building to access sound federal award data. Once that comes in, the rest of this makes more sense to a lot of people, and it's easier to do. Happy to take any questions now or any time later. Thanks.
So earlier there was a discussion on the definition of expenditure, and you've said USA spending a number of times. USA spending is probably a misnomer. It should be USA obligations, not expenditures. Is the reason USA spending doesn't work is because it's not expenditures, it's obligations? Or is it because you don't have line item data and it's not enough? What is it in USA spending that's not working?
It's probably all the above. And again, here I am saying negative things. We actually had a pretty good week pulling this number out by zip code and seeing, and this was again to somebody's point earlier, you're not seeing as many examples where Maryland State Department of Education and MSDE are listed separately. Somebody's catching these, somebody's cleaning it up. A lot of the people in the room probably deserve credit for that. And the other piece I haven't mentioned is state fiscal year versus federal fiscal year. And that's still going to be an issue for us to deal with because that varies a lot by state. My reports are done by state fiscal year, which we did initially because it was just easier to do. And that's, I know some of the states want to see information. Again, it gets to David's point of what's possible versus what would you like. I think some of the states would love to see this split out in ways that just would be really difficult for the federal government to do. So that doesn't get to your specific question, but there's a list of other things like that. And even the searchability, just constituent pulls it open for the first time. Real basic, you see the wrong columns on the left side. You see long lists of numbers, and it takes somebody with a decent amount of IT expertise just to be able to get in and move these things around initially.
Let me build off of Dick's question in terms of the various issues that you see and pose the question, what do you see as the highest priority among the different issues that we've talked about today? And I'll kind of pose the same question to others who will present after Eric in terms of, all right, if you had to move out on the first issue, what would that issue be? Would it be accuracy? Would it be completeness? Would it be expenditure versus obligation? Give us your thoughts in terms of where you think the highest priority should be.
Okay, and speaking, again, as the rep from the states here, just the accuracy of information, to be able to talk to a new governor staffer from another state who said, what can I get from USA spending? He or she should be able to pull out every live grant into their state and into their state government. They should be just basic levels of making it something that looks like it's right before you get into any of the other details. And that's a matter of organizing information that's already in there. So I think that's the easier part, and I'd pick off little bits of things that people can see benefits on initially before getting caught up in too many of the other areas. So it's a lot, and that's what we've learned in this exercise, dragging through the zip code thing for this county thing. There's a lot of good information in there. It is better today than it was before. So again, I don't want to almost regret saying that, but we're seeing more information. We're seeing little agencies that I know weren't in there before all of a sudden popping up. And yet for a constituent to use this, to be able to hit Harford County, I want to see everything that's touching Harford County. They still can't do that. Or I want to see every Maryland State Department of Education piece. You can do that. Send it to my grants person at education, and she would be able to spot an error within about 10 seconds. It doesn't have Title I grants, or it doesn't have something in there. So the standard data, that's the basic Data Act issues. And without, I know that the bill's caught up in all sorts of different issues here. Just the most basic information that's in there, make it searchable, make it easy to get at, and then pick off some of the other things.
So you're really saying that the site there's a problem with accuracy, completeness, but also the usability of the site.
Yeah, and the usability, again, it's interesting. There are 3 people in my office, the woman who does our reports. She said, okay, let's see this year if we can take it over. She just started searching in the data box on the front, putting Maryland State Government in. It wasn't until I dragged her back to the toolbar on the top, and you've got summaries, you've got a few tabs on the front that actually got you in where you could see what's going to Maryland, what's staying in Maryland. So even at that level, there's someone who's pretty good at this, not hitting the right thing off the bat. And then even when she pulls up the spreadsheet, she was sort of showing me the stuff you care about. It's way off on the right. You got to go scanning and RSTUV before you see some of the things most people would care about. So there's some easy things like that that are that I think are fixable. And the problem is a lot of people used it won't go back again. It's like a bad experience at a restaurant. It takes a lot to get you in there the second time. And our office, it's our job to sort of know this stuff. But we'll, so again, every time you have a bad experience, you walk away from it. Now we're forced to come back again because the FFR stuff is so old. But I bet the user figures on it are probably disappointingly low, especially compared to the heyday for the Recovery Act site when the numbers were through the roof.
Would it help if the data there was also tied back to programs, federal programs?
Absolutely, and that's and that's hard to do though. And that again got to the Norm's point. The more you're tying that in, the tougher it's going to be. So tying funds to NASA programs is going to be harder than NSF for some HUD programs. A lot of programs out there, and for us, as an example, at the state level, tying our federal funds to Governor O'Malley's 16 policy goals. There's been a 3-year process, and it's pretty good, but I'm sure somebody could pick holes in it. So while that would be valuable and would get a lot of interest, I think would make your job tougher to get more people looking and using the site.
I was intrigued by your use of policy goals. So you've taken your strategic plan and adapted those to all the programs for which you get federal funding.
Yeah, and it's meant, again, 472 grants, not every one of them hits a policy goal, but if you're a mid-sized state agency, you've got limited resources going after competitive grants, you better want to know what the governor cares about and prioritize your resources there, which isn't to say you don't want to do a marine mammal fisheries grant if it's an important thing to have, but at least make the cabinet secretaries think about those things before they allocate the time for the staff. And it also, in a strange way, helps nonprofits. They say, look, the state of Maryland has a goal here. They're allocating state funds, federal funds. We're going to write a grant to the ABC Foundation, and it's going to leverage the other money in there. So they use the data in that way. So just, our little report is actually leveraging funds in ways we probably can't take credit for, but it wouldn't have happened without the report.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Scott Amy from Project on Government Oversight, commonly known as POGO.
Okay. Well, good morning. I want to thank the board for the opportunity to testify before you today. I am Scott Amy, the General Counsel of the Project on Government Oversight, also known by the acronym POGO here around Washington, D.C. Throughout our 33-year history, POGO has worked to remedy waste, fraud, abuse, corruption in government spending in order to achieve a more effective, accountable, open, and ethical government. POGO has a keen interest in accountability and transparency matters, and I'm pleased to share POGO's thoughts with the board today. Why are we here? Is kind of the first question I think that we need to ask. And one of the reasons is that in fiscal year 2013, we spent over $960 billion on grants and contracts. I mean, let's get down to talking about money. I mean, we're talking about $460 billion on contracts, which is actually a decline of about $60 billion. We're also talking about $503 billion on grants. So at that point, you know, those numbers are down. We used to be at close to the $1.1 trillion level, but we're talking about real money here, whether it's going to states, universities, contractors, or individuals, and we have to worry about that. But there are three main things to focus on when we're considering transparency of federal spending. First is the public isn't receiving comprehensive or an accurate picture of federal spending. Two, the government's stovepipe mentality and approach on creating, organizing, and maintaining federal resources confuses the public, as the last speaker said. I mean, I think there is a lot of confusion about what data sources there are. Many years ago, I presented a paper called Contract Spending Escaping the Dark Ages, and I had a list of probably 20 different resources that you have to use to try to track information on federal contractors. And third, that there's a long list of impediments that remove data from public view that hinders transparency. So this isn't just as easy, let's throw it all up there, but we do have to massage different things as far as, you know, issues related to the federal government and how we release information, commercial proprietary data that will cause a decline in competition or reveal information about contractors' proprietary work secrets that we do have to massage. So it's not that easy, but I think the biggest thing is how do we automate this process? I mean, law firms have done it for years in document review. There are ways that we can automate it. Data Act, I think, gets us to a lot of those, and you've heard a lot of the theories and concepts from previous speakers, so I don't want to spend time on that. And the question is, okay, let's talk about some specifics. In 2010, we looked at defense service contracts. So government buys goods or services through contracts, right? Services are about 60% of the dollars that we spend these days. So we looked at just DOD service contract spending. And this is where the confusion comes in, as Chairman Jinman asked the question earlier about the misnomer with USA spending, that it's on obligations. But here, when you try to look at defense service contract spending in one fiscal year, listen to the differential in numbers. The budget request was $138 billion. Budget execution, according to the executive branch, was $181 billion. The inventory of service contracts provided by DOD was about $121 billion. Budget totals in FPDS, or I guess obligated dollars in FPDS, were $204 billion, and budget execution according to OMB was $254 billion. We're not talking about $10 billion, something we can just sweep under the rug. I mean, the differential there is $133 billion. That differential is higher than what some of the federal agencies are reporting that the Department of Defense obligated or spent or handed out or wrote checks for, whatever you want to call it. $133 billion is the differential in the money that we spend on service contracts. Unfortunately, it's the gift that keeps giving for people in the watchdog community, but let's look at healthcare.gov. CGI put out a press release when they were asked to create the website for their bid was $94 million. Federal contract data in USA spending for obligations was $193 million. Secretary Sebelius said that we've actually only spent $112. That's confusing to the American public. That's confusing to the agencies. I mean, there's integrity issues there. I mean, that's not all an accuracy issue, and probably none of it is. All three of those numbers may be accurate. I mean, the question is, though, what are we telling the American public about how we are spending millions and billions and hundreds of billions of dollars annually on grants and contracts when there's three numbers floating around? During that time in October and November, I couldn't tell you how many hours I spent on the phone with staffers on the Hill as well as members of the media to walk them through USA spending to try to show them the difference in what CGI's press release stated versus what the obligated dollars are. And to tell you the truth, I actually avoided, like the previous speaker said, USA spending altogether. I went to fafata.org, which is run, or used to be run, I think it's been taken down in the months since then. But I went to fafata.org because, one, it was a much easier search engine to use, is more intuitive, and there was a lot easier way to say to them, enter CGI in, go here, organize by date, and then here's where this contract is, here are all the different orders that are attached to that contract, and now you can actually export it over to a little file, you can add them up, and sum total all of them, and you'll see where the government is saying that we're close to $200 million, despite CGI saying they only received a 2-year contract for 94, and the difference then in asking HHS why they're claiming that we've only spent $112 million. And so what can we do here? The first is contracting transparency is essential to better buying. USA spending should become the one-stop shop for government officials and the public to use for all information. We need actual copies of contracts, delivery and task orders, modifications, amendments, other transactions, grants, leases, you name it. The whole ball of wax should be in there at this point. Subcontracts as well, and I know somebody mentioned earlier that we're struggling with subcontracting reporting, but also, and I think it was one of the biggest things with the Recovery Act, is how to get below first-tier stuff. I mean, unfortunately, and I see it every day in my job, we're seeing second, third, fourth, fifth-tier subcontractors. That may raise other contracting issues about why are we going to the 5-tier subcontract level. You know, is that a bundled contract that may be one illegal or two that we're not getting the best bang for our buck? But that's a separate contracting question, but it is an accountability and transparency question as well. But additionally, proposals, solicitations, award decisions, justifications, including all documents, audits, performance and responsibility data, all other related documents should be incorporated in USA spending. And that's, unfortunately, the problem is it is the alphabet soup. You have FPDS, you have USA spending, you have FBO, you have GAO, you have, right down the list of different places, FAPIS, ORCA, PEEPers. I mean, you name it, there's an alphabet soup in Washington, D.C. of all the different places that you need to do to track contract spending information. The other thing I would also say is a few years ago, like we don't always have to reinvent the wheel, there was a panel on that took a look at service contracts, and then following that there was a panel on coming up with issues related to cost data. I think it was organized by Loretta Doan, I think, when she was inside GSA. But one of the things was real-time pricing. We have GSA schedules that we spend $30, $40 billion, $50 billion a year on. And at that point, why do we only get to see the pricing proposals? I mean, if they're really commercial items, Amazon's figured it out. I mean, I can see real-time pricing on Amazon, what people are paying. I can see reviews. Why aren't we providing similar services to the American public as well as federal officials, specifically federal officials, in trying to get real-time cost data as far as what we just bought for the latest microphone, chair, staple, whatever it is, services that we're paying for? Why can't we see the latest prices paid rather than the proposed prices that may not be as low as what we're actually paying for? Expand service contract inventory data. DOD and civilian agencies in particular have a real hard time telling us how much we spend. We spend $280 billion a year on services. The government has a very hard time telling us any information about that, but when it's making up 60% of our federal contract spending, I think that we need to do a lot better job in knowing how many people are actually performing services for the government, and also what are they doing and how much are we paying them to do those jobs. Past performance data should be made publicly available. I consider this the report card of the federal government. But one of the things that I don't think you've heard a lot about is results. I mean, at the end of the day, we've talked about spending, we talk about tracking it, people want to know. But I think you also have to include in that we need to also figure out how well, what goods and services are we buying, and how well are those goods and services being provided to the federal government. Past performance data has always been considered commercial proprietary. However, if you go to certain GAO bid protests that are on past performance, you get to see summary data of that information. You also get to see it in federal contracting, whether it's the Department of Defense or the Civilian Court of Federal Claims. You get to see that type of information in their opinions when there are bid protests by other contractors. So I would like to see more performance data available to the public so then we can make judgments about certain contractors. At that point, that really truly becomes an accountability issue to make sure that we're not doing business with risky contractors. The results of our spending, we hear about it in presidential budgets, appropriations, continuing resolutions, unfortunately, contracts award and grant awards, but little comes out about the results. And we need better checks and balances on the government, on its contractors, on grantees, and the agencies themselves to make sure, policies are appropriate, missions, programs are all running as well as they should be, and that we're getting most bang for our buck. Without the start to finish oversight over the process, the public is left with the feeling that money is lost. The appearance of impropriety has two significant negative impacts on the public. First, it exacerbates the public's distrust in government, and two, it ultimately results in a decline in civic participation. So we are truly talking about getting people to want to care about the federal government and not just Washington, D.C. is a black hole where my money goes and we don't know what comes of it. I thank you for the board for the opportunity to appear today, and I look forward working with the board on any further items that we can work toward to gain a more accountable and transparent government. Thank you.
I'd just like to talk about healthcare.gov for a moment. I think the earlier number was the original contract given to CGI, and there were modifications since that point. So I don't think you're ever going to be able to go and look at a press release from a company and then know what happened 6-10 months after that.
Certainly.
The other issue is, I think that Dick has brought up, is expenditures versus obligations.
Right.
And the question the Secretary was asked was about outlays, not obligations. So I don't know. I think you're always going to have those inconsistencies. I was going to ask, have you looked at performance.gov, or if I agree with you that results are very important and that we have to become more of a government that has goals, not just programs. Programs are just tools to goals, but has that been useful?
Not very.
Not very?
Well, and again, it's the stovepipe mentality that it's another place you have to go. Consolidating all that information in one place would be great. I think one of the questions that someone asked was about getting it down to the program level. It would be nice that we'd see everything from the solicitation level down to whatever those modifications or amendments to a contract would be, but then what the final out product was. A few years ago, I requested information from the State Department on grants on human trafficking. I actually supplied the State Department with a list of those grants off their own website, and they came back to me and said, well, we need numbers. We can't track them by the names, the dates, and who the recipient was. I actually then printed out the spreadsheet that they had on their own website. I supplied it back to them with a coordinated FOIA request that was listed A through Z and married them all up to my request and said, here it is, and they still haven't filled my FOIA request. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it is very difficult to track, and at the end of the day, I'm not sure what these grantees were paid for and then what the final product was. I mean, were they doing advertising? Were they doing training? Were they doing, some kind of mission work in trying to prevent human trafficking? But at the end of the day, it just seems like we handed millions of dollars over to a lot of grantees to follow human trafficking efforts around the world, and at that point, is that money well spent? The other thing I just wanted to say is there is a savings element here, and I know there's also a cost element, where there's a cost element on the states, there's a cost element on the federal government and agencies to do this. But I do think that, the fact that we would have declining requests for this information, the fact that I have to FOIA information, a contract right now in the year 2014 is somewhat absurd. That's a waste of a lot of people's time, including my own. You're going to reduce bid protests. I think you're going to also then save a lot of money. So I think it has to be looked at as an investment for future. And one thing I actually did want to say that I didn't get out here in my presentation was the old Justice Brandeis statement about sunshine is the best disinfectant. It's 100 years old. Its birthday was, I think, December 2013, 100 years old. And we're in a room right now having a meeting about how to add sunshine to the federal government. And I think, let's make it work in the next 5 years or 3 years, something like that. Let's not wait hundreds of years to actually make this a reality. So, any other questions?
Scott, I think that was a very rich, vast presentation, but I think part of it was you're suggesting that contracts be made publicly available.
Certainly.
Are you at all sympathetic to contractors' objections to that, proprietary or?
None, no. Of course. And that's where an automated system could automatically, obviously there's certain lines in a contract that come to me every time that are redacted. Line item information, pricing information, award fee information, incentive fee information, percentages, all come redacted. That system can already be created to at least give me the summary data. It would be nice to see scope of work, prior to having to either go data mine FBO to figure out what it was. But it'd be nice to see it in other places. It would be nice to see what the changes and modifications are than some small coded section in USA Spending where you get a description of a contract that usually comes out and looks like, probably the back coding on a website of a lot of letters and numbers, and then there may be some text. I mean, it was in the example of healthcare.gov. It was very difficult even to figure out what CGI contract was the contract for that. They had 2 or 3 other contracts that looked more for web support services and web building and maintenance and creation than the one that it was actually coded under. I mean, we were able to track it down by date. But the fact that we have to jump through that many hoops and there's that much confusion about it, yes, I would like to see the contracts online. It'd be nice if it would be right through the RFP. It would be everything that included in the pre-award documentation. The contract award, somebody mentioned earlier, it would be great to have better contract award notices and congruency in those, right down then to everything that else, the contract itself, and then everything post-contract, anything else that it needs to be put out there on what the deliverables were, and then are we getting those deliverables? I think that's some of the biggest issues, and obviously these issues comes up when there's a crisis. I mean, when healthcare.gov is the worst case scenario, but it's also a great learning tool, But it came up. Why was this contract selected? Why was this contractor selected? Why did the money go from 94 to an obligation of 193 or a spend of 112? Why were there so many modifications? Specifically in that, why were there so many modifications in April? I mean, we haven't seen all the finger pointing yet, but I think that's about the time when there were some problems known with the system. There were certain things that were going on. If that would have been public, maybe we would have had a fix a lot longer before, in 2013, before we brought in an elite core of IT contractors and are now even moving on to a new contractor in that case, So, I mean, this is where the accountability and transparency comes in, and that's where transparency can really help. I mean, for the previous speaker, the question was asked, what would my number one priority be? And I would say probably get as much up there as possible. We can, you have citizen journalists and investigators and a lot of people in this room and elsewhere watching on the webinar here, in which they can actually help add the completeness and the accuracy, and maybe other vendors will do it, maybe the public will do it, maybe reporters will do it. If there's a reporting feature on there that allows people to ask a question about a specific entry of a grant or a contract, then maybe we can fix that. But let's get the information up there. If we're just going to do that and try to get everything complete and accurate, we'll be waiting another 100 years before I think that system is up and running and run well.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Sean Moulton, did I pronounce it correctly? With the Center for Effective Government.
Oh, okay. So thank you for having this meeting and allowing me to speak. My name is Sean Moulton. I'm the Director of Open Government Policy at the Center for Effective Government, formerly known as OMB Watch. Here we go. As I said, we're a small nonprofit advocacy group here in Washington, D.C., interested in promoting good regulatory process, open and accountable federal budget, and in general, government openness. But beyond our own personal interest in federal spending, I wanted to point out that in 2006, prior to the passage of the FFATA law and then the subsequent build of USA Spending, we launched fedspending.org, which made grants and contracts available and searchable. We've been running it ever since. We've had tens of millions of searches done, a wide variety of users, the media, state legislators and their staff, the public, researchers, big corporate percentage of users, I will say, market researchers, people in there interested in their competitors. I didn't get the bid. Who got that bid? So it's been interesting, and it's given us a much broader perspective on what people want out of this data, what questions they're trying to answer, and I thought I would point it out. I'll also just note, in interest of full disclosure, that we were sub-license or subcontractor and licensed our programming to be the launching point for USA Spending. It has been significantly built out since then, but we did receive money to give a jump start to USA Spending, and probably some of our coding and programming is still in there. You asked, what is your interest? What questions are you trying to answer with your federal spending information? Well, from my organization's perspective, we're definitely interested in overall trends, agency trends, contracting, which companies are getting money, how well are we competing the contracts that are going out, how long are these contracts running. Also interested in grants around, which states are getting the largest amounts. What are they for? Are they for housing? Are they for education? We've done projects with geographic breakdowns where we map the place of performance, which can be challenging, I know, for agencies to do with larger grants, larger contracts. The place of performances can be quite spread out, but we found it very interesting to put it up against demographic information, jobs and unemployment, looking at minority spread, income distribution in the United States, housing data that you can get, and then you match up programs that are designed to do stuff to address housing issues. And then also, of course, we're very interested, as Scott was just mentioning, on performance. Data's not there, but we're always interested in how these recipients have delivered on whatever it is we contracted or granted with them to do. In terms of the users that we've heard from, and we've gotten feedback over the years just through a sort of a normal evolutionary process, emails from people getting on the site wanting more help. But we've also done surveys of our users to specifically try and figure out who they are and what they want. And so this is just a sample. Definitely the public interested in who's receiving money in my area, my state, my county, my city, and what for, what products, purchases, what services. Then we get into some more specific things. Reporters interested in a specific contractor award. We get that a lot. Maybe it's a company or a contract, such as the healthcare.gov. It gets into the news, and everyone wants to know about that one. But sometimes it's more forward-looking. They are particularly interested in a company or a particular type of service or product. What money can nonprofits receive? We get this a lot out at the state and local level. People who are interested in applying for grants, and they want to figure out if it's possible, does the government support the kind of work I do? If so, which agencies? Who do I talk to? I mean, there's a lot of follow-up questions to that. And then we get into the areas, as I mentioned, a lot of use by market researchers and companies trying to figure out market share, whether it's IT and web support, consulting, building, whatever it is. They want to figure out who has the inside corner, maybe try and figure out how it is they got there, what opportunities they have. It is, I will say, a large portion of our users. And finally, there's this mix of people who want to use the information, again, coupled up with other information. One of the most recent ones we got was an inquiry where someone was very interested in taking the spending information and trying to link it up with campaign contributions and that kind of thing, and seeing if there's any correlation. So the next question that was asked was, where do we find that information right now? And there are a number of federal sites, USA Spending, obviously, the website itself running the searches and the large data downloads. We use that a lot because when we update Fed spending. Recovery.gov, some people are interested not just in the spending writ large, but they're interested in that recovery money still. FPDS, the agencies directly, especially when you try and work your way back to budget estimates. And then, of course, our site, fedspending.org. The next question was, where does federal spending information need clearer instructions or explanations? And we have a few ideas based on our experience. On USA Spending, some people have already mentioned, it can be daunting to use. If you're steeped in spending information and procurement, it's much easier, and this could be rectified to some extent by changing the user interface, making it more intuitive, but also tutorials explaining people how to do the most basic searches they're interested in doing. This could simply be written files in the simplest form, or we've all seen those tutorials where you click on it and actually you get a little video and it shows you exactly where to click, gives you an example of doing that kind of a search and pulling that information. A major one that I've gotten calls on are how to link prime and subrecipients. You have to do two separate searches right now on USA Spending, and people really want, because some people are used to the recovery information, they're used to it being linked, and they want to know how they can link it, and it is a complicated procedure. Definitions. This has also been mentioned before, but there are some very vague terms within these within the database for contracts for grants, building improvements, construction, IT support, and people don't know what it means. They're just too vague. Was it build a website? Was it maintain a website? Or was it improve a website? And there's also these esoteric procurement terms. The examples here: definitive contract, fixed term price, letter contract. That right now there's no glossary to explain to your average user what does that mean, and they can easily get lost in this. Another area, contract descriptions. Right now, you're lucky if the contract description, or for that matter, the award description, is a complete sentence with a verb and a noun. Very often, it's a title. It is a noun, a word, sometimes maybe two, and that's a huge frustration for people. They want to know, this was a big contract or a big transaction or obligation. What was it for? And you can't find that out. Again, this was an area where recovery.gov and the recovery information took it a very good step forward. Their descriptions were paragraphs, really explained what was the project in greater detail, and I think we need to get into that. And I think a better explanation of this links between, right now this is a transaction-based database. It's not a contract database. Some of them are contracts, some of them are task orders, some of them are modifications. Some are just de-obligations because we obligated a lot of money and it didn't actually cost us that much. And we get questions like that from the public. They say, wait, I see this big negative $25 million. Did the company give $25 million back to the government? I say that's very rare. If they get the money, they're probably going to keep the money. What that really is probably an adjustment. The government never actually gave that money to them. This was an obligation, didn't cost that much, which is a good thing. But the other problem there is that de-obligation, it can be a year or 2 years later. And so you can have a spike in 1 year where the spending looks huge, and then another year where the spending looks greatly reduced, and it's not coming out to be an accurate portrayal. And finally, how to get additional information. And I'm not just talking about a series of links to, here are other resources for you. Because again, the average public, they don't want to have to click through 12 different links to try and figure out which one was the right one for what they wanted. We need to point people in a direction based on what it is they're trying to answer. And so we need to say, are you looking for X? Then here's where you go. Are you looking for Y? Well, then here's where you should try and search. And so right now there are a series of sort of resource links on USA Spending, but it needs to be more better explained to the public. So what suggestions do you have for prioritizing enhancements? So again, here I'm going to split between what would be our priorities as an organization and my priorities as a researcher and an advocate, and then the things we've heard from the users. And there's a lot of overlap, but I will echo what Scott Amy said about award documents and bid solicitations. We want these documents up. I'm cognizant of the concerns around confidential business information, and on the grant side, intellectual property rights by researchers who don't want their methodology revealed to everyone and kind of lose their competitive edge either. And I think these can be addressed. That being said, I think those concerns on both sides of the equations are somewhat overstated. We have examples of states who post unredacted all of their contracts. And there is no market problem. This does not crash people's ability to get the contracts and still participate in these programs. So while I think we can address it and we can solve some of these complaints, I wouldn't want to go too far. I think the balance should be struck toward disclosing more information to the public. More and better subrecipient data. As I said, right now they're not linked, which is a huge problem. But more importantly, I'm not sure we're getting all of the information. The numbers that I'm seeing, the percentages I'm seeing sub-granted and sub-awarded from the contracts and grants right now in USA Spending is at a much lower rate than we saw in the recovery spending. And I might expect that there were things we are doing year-round that didn't make it into the recovery, and so that might bring the rate down. Some of that might not be subbed out, but I would expect it to be a lot closer. And so I am concerned we're not getting all the subrecipient information, even to this first tier. And we do need to figure out ways to get to further tiers. I mean, the public just isn't satisfied when they see that the state got a huge award and then they gave it out to the counties for, let's say, road construction. They haven't seen where the money went. I mean, they see how it got divided up geographically, but they don't know who built anything. And that's just not a satisfactory level of accountability. Expanded types of data on spending: salaries, benefits, leases, rent. There's a lot in there. There's missing parts of the government. Now, this is there are agencies that didn't participate right away because they're separate. They're independent agencies, quasi-independent agencies. We need to make sure they're in. But I can tell you that there's also this desire to see the legislative branch. Maybe it has to be done in a separate site, but I can tell you that a lot of people would like it put in the same site. And we see state-level sites where they do have that together. And the interesting thing, and I'll just point this out, it's just funny, the legislative branch is listed in USA Spending. You can do searches for the House or the Senate. You get no results. But it's on the pull-down menu for the options of what agencies you can search for, and I've never understood that. The information is simply not collected, but they put it on the list of go ahead and search, and I don't know what the public's thinking when they do a search and it says Congress spent no money, because that we all know is not true. So identifiers, and I could do a whole other presentation on identifiers, especially entity identifiers. And we've heard some of it, the Dun & Bradstreet problems, the award identifiers. This is really critical if you're going to use this data and link it up and figure out, what companies got in total, link up these different transactions to a single contract. It is critical. It is challenging. It's not an easy problem to solve, but we need to be working on it, and so we can't just put it off and do all the easy stuff. We need to start working on some of the harder things. And then search improvement. Be able to search for things like the numbers of bids received relative to a contract, so we can see what were the things that most bids were received for and the least bids received for, whether closely associated with inherently governmental functions. These are things that on fpds.gov you can search for, but you can't right now in USA Spending. So if we're going to have a one-stop shop, we should really start to pull these other features and functions from other sites and make sure they're still available on our central site. And last, I wanted to point out some of the things that we heard from our users. And again, they do echo some of our priorities, but I think they put sometimes a slightly different spin on it. There's definitely an interest in actual contracts, but also additional information on specific awards. And again, this gets to both the companies out there who want to figure out how did they get this contract, how do I get this contract, or an award, grantee who wants to get grant money from the government. They're trying to figure out the system. And I think letting them get a better view into the system is a good thing, to see bids, to see the successful bid as best you can, because then we get a better pool of competition for awards and grants and contracts, and the public gets a better product in the end. This shouldn't be a system where a small group of contractors and grant applicants, they understand how to make the application better, and so they get the money. That their real advantage to the public is they know better how to write an award request. Again, more ways to find out about government program. People really wanted to then, when they saw something on, let's say, winterization of homes, where can I find something on, like, I can't click through to the program to find out why the government's working on this. The Scott Amy's example of human trafficking. You can't just go and find out what's the government's plan, what's the strategy. You can go do another search in Google and come up with a bunch of sites, but if we're going to have stuff listed by programs, we should be trying to feed people out into these programs. Again, clear linkage between prime and subrecipients. An interesting one that people had, loan repayments. There's guaranteed loans, there's loans that the government makes itself, but there's also a lot where it's kind of a split between private and U.S.-backed loans. And people are always wondering, did we get paid back? If so, then this wasn't an expenditure so much as, again, a loan, and we got the money back, and did we get it back on time? And then we've had requests for more charts and graphs. There's a map on the site, and there's this interesting kind of timeline feature that allows you to do these bubble graphs that change over time, which is really cool but difficult to use. And people just want to see some more pie charts and bar charts, things that would more easily explain in an intuitive way the level of spending, the trends, and how it's broken up. And I will stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you. I was that good.
So our next and last speaker is Dr. Roman von Donaker from the Association of Government Accountants.
Well, first I want to thank all the board for giving us the opportunity to present some information, and for all of you out there for working with us as part of AGA. Let me take a little different tact, and let me give you just a little bit of a background so you have an idea where I'm coming from. For 30 years, I was a professor of accounting at the University of Kentucky. I taught governmental accounting. For 25 of those years, I was the executive director of the National Association of State Auditors, Controllers, and Treasurers. And for the last 11 years, I have been the executive director of AGA. So I'm coming at it from a different perspective. And the perspective is one of the questions that I would raise in the intermediate accounting class is, why do we do what we do? Well, we provide information so people can make decisions. Now, it's very important that you pick up the word information, because right now we are drowning in data and we're starving for information. We can't boil the ocean. And in many of the presentations, there's been a discussion of a number of things that could be done. That everybody wants to boil the ocean. We want this. It's not information. We want this data. And I believe that we do have a responsibility to provide the data and turn it into information. And one of the questions is, and this has been a discussion point here, of talking about the citizens. Who are the citizens? Now, I've heard an awful lot of discussions about the citizens want this and citizens want that. I'm a citizen, and I didn't want any of this stuff. All right? All of you are citizens. You were interested in all this stuff? Now, you may, as an individual, you may, as a small group, be interested in this data so that you can turn it into information. But I think you glorify this in terms of saying this is what the citizens want. Because if we are going to provide the citizens with the information, don't you think we better go out and ask them what they want? Don't infer that the citizens want this information or that my three friends have asked that question. We're dealing with over 300 million people out there. And what I want to know is, what are those people interested in? Not so much that I'm going to get all 300 million of them, but that I want to go out there and I want to find out. And I want to find out what it is that you want as an agency head. When we talk about providing this data, we're providing the data to a multiplicity of users, as was mentioned. But I think what's overlooked is we've never asked those users what it is that they want. Somehow we have inferred that we know what they want. Well, I'll be doggone if anybody's talked about anything I'm interested in. Now, one of the things that we did, and I talk about this in the intermediate class, we talk about financial statements. And the financial statements keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And who uses them? Nobody uses them. Nobody can understand them. So what I have suggested and what we have done as AGA is that we sit down and begin to look at those statements and begin to ask people what it is that they really want. And so what we did was we put together a bunch of focus groups. And that what we came up with was a 4-page document that people indicated that they were interested in. And this is what we have called the Citizen-Centric Report. And many of you have seen the Citizen-Centric Report. And the one that I have here is in fact for AGA. We broke it up into 4 pages. The first page deals with demographics, how many members and how many citizens would you have, et cetera, et cetera. The second page is performance. What are the performance indicators people are interested in? And don't be like the person and the lady in Oregon who, when we talked about him, said, now, that page is just not big enough because we got 432 performance indicators that we want to get on that page. And I said, man, we can't do this. There've got to be 5 or 6 of them that people are really interested in. Third page, financial page, pie charts. All right, bar graphs. Where did the money come from? Where did it go? Fourth page, what are the challenges of this government? And it doesn't have to be a government. We've had them done for churches. We've had them done for nonprofits. We've had them done at the state level. We've had them done at the federal level. They've tied it into some of the SEER programs. Here's SBA's. Nice little document that can be passed out that people can begin to understand. Now, there is a multiplicity of other information that's out there that many of the other public interest groups might be interested in, or individuals might be interested in. But the problem, it seems to me, is that when you begin to get into that discussion, you are talking about so much data that it becomes overwhelming. Now, I don't know if any of you have ever written a dissertation. The dissertation is the whole thing about the doctoral program. And when you sit down first time and try to determine, because this is for the first time, nobody is telling you when the exam is, nobody's telling you what's on the exam, you're figuring it out, you have to get the data, you have to write up the report, you have to finish the report. This is scary. And so what you have to do is you have to begin to sit down in the chair with a blank piece of paper and start writing. And there's only one definition of a good dissertation, and that's one that's finished. If it's not finished, it isn't any good. You know, what we've got to do is we've got to begin to develop this kind of activity so that we can begin to take the data that's coming out and make it information. And for whom and for what? All right, different people. One of the things is that we have done this for the citizens. We've done it for our members. Next step is we're doing it for the elected officials. The elected officials are, at least in my mind, an entirely different group. What are they interested in? Well, let's sit down and try to figure that out. Then we would move on to others, whether it be the unions, whether it be the creditors, etc. But in that way, you begin to work on providing information. You know, David Quam made a tremendous point that I don't even think he saw, or at least I saw it, but I don't know about him. Why do you think the Recovery Board information worked between the government, governors, and the vice president and the administration? Because they had to sit down and talk about what information they wanted. And there was a meeting of the minds. That's why it worked. And it was mentioned before, Amazon. Amazon's giving you information. You're getting the information because you want to buy something. They're not telling you about 12 different other things. You're interested in buying a particular camera. They're going to show you all the cameras. That's not data. That's information. Now you're sitting down. So it's true. The Amazon is an excellent example, but for a different reason. And the David Quam example is a very good illustration. Now, AGA is a member organization of financial professionals in government. We lead and encourage change that benefits our field and all the citizens that we have. The networking events, professional certification, publications, and ongoing education help members build their skills and advance their careers. It's one of the things I'm very, very concerned about. The government is not catching up with their skills. The private sector is going to just eat them alive because the skills are not being done. As you well know, the first thing that's cut is training. It's the worst thing in the world. We have 15,000 members. We're all over the country. We're in Japan. We're in the Marianas. We're in Guam, Saipan. Now, many governments are struggling to communicate the business of government to residents, particularly when presenting information about how taxpayer money is allocated and spent. This citizen-centric report details the government finance at a level that the citizens can begin to understand. It provides community information such as population figures, We're trying to work with different governments so that through the Office of Local Government, all local governments will do this. The problem we have is this is not required. I mean, if this was a financial statement, it'd be required. But then again, with the financial statements, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, when it was started in the states, the first state it started in was Maryland. Louis Goldstein, for those of you who remember the old Louis, was the first one. Then it went to Tennessee. That was 1979. Kansas was the last state in. And you would have thought it'd be 1980, right? Kansas was in 1994. That's a CAFR. And it took 15 years to get Kansas in. So to say, oh, you know, you don't have 100,000 of these yet, you're just not going to get them. I mean, the CAFR was required. It took 15 years. You know, federal agencies are required to prepare a PAR, or an agency financial report. With those reports, agencies produce a summary of performance and financial information, most of which are 15, 20, 30 pages long. Who's going to read 15, 20, 30 pages? Nobody. You really got to need a night's sleep in order to read those. All right? 4 pages? That's my only contribution to this whole document. I said it couldn't be more than 4 pages. Because if it's 4 and you make it 5, 5 will become 6 and 6 will become 7. And who knows, we'll be up to the 20 and 30 pages. I asked Dave Walker once upon a time when he was Comptroller General, I said, Dave, you know, how you doing with the GAO report? The GAO report being used by anybody? And he said, no, really, it's not being. I said, well, how long is it? He says it's 28 pages. I said, there's your answer. Who's going to read 28 pages? I said, why don't you get down to 4? I'll help you with 4. All right? I mean, I'm tickled pink that the Department of Treasury has gotten the Citizen's Guide down to 6 or 7 pages. Now, I've asked Scott Bell to work a little harder and get it down to 4 pages. All right? People will begin to read it then. NSF has used the shortened report as the annual report. The beauty of these shortened reports is they meet the requirements as prescribed by OMB for the summaries, but also just give enough information for the average citizen to understand the agency mission, performance, and financial data, and its challenges for the future. Now, what federal spending information do you need to answer these questions? Legally, each entity must offer a performance and accountability or agency financial report, and this is the information that we would use to create a 4-page report. Where do you find that federal spending information now? Well, you got it in data.gov, performance.gov, usaspending.gov, all the .govs up there. The beauty of the initial report by the board was that it was in one place. All right? Now, all of a sudden, we got 3,000 .govs. Who's going to find this? You know, we need to provide information so that my wife will read it. She is not going up on the website to look for anything. It'd be hard enough to get her to read the 4 pages. But I think I got a shot at the 4 pages. Nothing beyond that. Do you think that the citizens know the appropriations are, you know, when we begin to talk about different agencies, we talk about, you know, the Department of the Interior, the Bureau of Land Management. Does anybody really know what all these agencies do? The Ocean Energy Management, or the Bureau of Reclamation. Most only know the National Park Service. You don't know any of these other things. What about the Department of Commerce? Department of Commerce has got NOAA, got the Bureau of the Census, National Institute of Science and Technology. One of the foundations really is trust in government. And I'm very concerned that we don't have any trust in government. This is a sad fact. This is a hallmark of democracy. And when we don't believe the government is truthful because we can't understand it and the information is not being made available to us, then we don't have any really democratic process. Now, I don't want to be an alarmist, but this has been deteriorating over time. And, you know, you got the Congress. I mean, if the Republicans say something, the Democrats say that's not true. And the Democrats say it, the Republicans say that's not true. Or it's just not all there. The information, I mean, we have worked with the CFO, the Chief Financial Officers Council, in putting together the SEER program. They asked us many years ago to do that. And we have put up the SEERs. And it would be an advance for government accountability for the and for citizens immediately if, in fact, this information was made available. And working in conjunction with them, we do have an award ceremony, and we want to recognize the quality that's actually available. Information that is accessible online in an honest and truthful format should be the goal for all governmental entities. The communications campaign should begin to help agencies make this a priority. For example, and you know, this is a plug for us, but I don't really care whether you use the CCR or you use something else. Use something. You got to get these reports down. You've got to think. We had a situation where we had the Commandant of the Coast Guard put together the CCR for the Coast Guard. And we began to talk to the Commandant, or actually the CFO, and he was talking about the editor of the particular document. And he said he kept rewriting and rewriting and rewriting, and finally the editor said that they understood. He said, you know who the editor was? It was my 16-year-old son. These are the people that we should be writing for. Now, we can do all this other stuff, but that's peripheral. But don't say that we're doing those other things for the citizens, because the citizens won't understand it. You know, data costs money. And when I'm not interested in just putting numbers out there and it costing me money, if in fact nobody's going to use it. Tell me how you're going to use it. Tell me why you're going to use it, and then we'll begin to put it together. We have a responsibility to do this. We're the people that need to do it. There isn't anybody else. You don't think there's somebody that's going to come in as a deus ex machina from the Greek tragedies and solve all of our problems. That's just not going to happen. So I guess what I would say, because as an academic I don't want to leave you in the lurch, pick a couple of areas and try to do this. Try to put together a 4-page document. Whether it be out of data.spending or data.gov or spending.gov or whatever. Figure out what is needed by those people, and then to begin to think in terms of the KISS principle, and that is to keep it simple. This is what we need. It can't be a performance report. There's too much text in that. You know, I do appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk to you. I think we've obviously been at a crossroads for a long time. We're at a major crossroads. We got all of this information up there, or all this data. None of it is really information. It may be information for 75 people at any one point in time. We got 300 and some million people out there. Let's talk about what it is that those people need. But before you figure that out, you're going to have to ask them. Ask the governors what they want. That's why it worked so much before. Ask the citizens what they want. Ask the unions what they want. Ask the effective, the public interest groups. What is it that you really want? Thank you very much, and I'll take any questions that you have. Kathy?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I would like to point out that the Recovery Board, in its reconstruction of recovery.gov and the enhancements we've done since then, that we did in fact actively seek citizen input to the structure of that website, as well as citizens and many other groups, and I think it greatly helped in making that site as usable, user-friendly as it is, and full of information, because we did listen to the citizens.
Well, that's very, very positive. Thank you. Dave?
I appreciated your presentation, and I agree with the central message, particularly asking the users much more than we do today. I'm getting a little bit cautious of hearing the term a million times, don't boil the ocean, though. I fear it's becoming the new, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And it's just an excuse for staring out the window sometimes, a lot of times. I think we live in an era when we can take on ambitious projects. Once we mapped the human genome, we entered a new stage. And I think there's enormous amounts of things we could do and should be doing. And our job is to find demons. I don't think we're going to find the devil in the brochure. We're going to find the devil in the details.
Well, I think the one thing that there, and I do agree with you, is that I guess what I would suggest is that the board have 2, 3, 4 things in a particular area that they would be interested in doing in terms of finding the kinds of reports that would answer some of the questions that have been raised. And in that way, you don't boil the ocean. You have limited it down, and then you begin to pick it off. And what I would hope is that you wind up with a domino effect, that if, in fact, you can do it here. I mean, that's what we're talking about with the elected officials. If we can take the citizens, then take the elected officials, then take the unions, then take whatever else there is in terms of that kind of information, we might not get exactly the same type of report, but that there will be some common areas, and that the third one and the fourth one and the fifth one will be easier than the first one and the second one. And I would hope that that's what you find here, that in terms of once the determination is made of the kinds of information that people are interested in, you then begin to create the report. Because somehow in here, you have to create a report that people can read. You can't just say that we're going to provide information, because your information and mine may be the same, but they may be totally different, and people can't make any comparison between the two. Norm, you look like you were ready to ask a question.
No, I think you just answered it.
Okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
So the schedule has recap and audience comments. So the members of the GAT board have asked a variety. Are there questions from the audience? Seeing none. So the last one is closing remarks from me, and I guess at some risk and perhaps with disagreement with my board members. These were sort of one-liners that I wrote down as people were going through the different presentations today. Data starts with a lot of them. Data standards, data dictionaries. From a USA Spending, I wrote down friendliness, but the tutorials. I mean, how do we get people so that they can actually find the data that's there and how to use it? Data is machine readable as opposed to a piece of paper. Is the data available? Can we publish it? Data one time was the discussion, I think, with pre-populating. Probably the one that scared me the most was line item. that's a far cry from where we are today. Not lose the lessons from the Recovery Board was said multiple numbers of time and what was there. The tie to appropriations and spending, a number of discussions with appropriations bills and spending bills. At least from my standpoint, that's one that we've been working on for some time and I think is really hard. Multiple references to program. And, GIPRA asked for program. We've had significant discussions. I think when we get to data dictionaries and data definitions, the definition of program is probably one of the hardest that we will deal with. I labeled this government family tree because it's the way we've been discussing it. We work very hard in the way we spend our money to be able, particularly on the corporate side, to be able to who reports to who and what it is, so that if I'm dealing with a single company, what are all the individual companies underneath? But can we do that on the government side as well? I think there was a discussion with LEI. I kept writing it down as LAI, but Legal Entity Identifier. But ought we not to have some kind of identifier so we can take a family tree of the government and roll that money up? I think I mentioned USA spending. Making more documents public. There's a slew of them out there. To our last speaker, it's the how many documents do you want and how many are there and how are you going to do the research and where are you going to go. I can kill you in a sea of it. Single source. And then the last one I wrote down from our last speaker's discussion was just information and how do we use information. Interestingly, and I started to ask this question, I'll just make it as a comment. I'll be candid with you. From my own personal perspective, and this is not a GAP board, but this is in the role that I play within the Department of Defense, my need for information far exceeds what I think the public wants. Scott Amy was talking about the dollars. We spent $308 billion last year. How did we spend it? What did we spend it on? How do I spend it smarter? And when you think about $308 billion, which is not the federal government, just in what we're doing, how do we do that and how do we go? So from my standpoint, I personally think the information on transparency and getting the data just personally inside my own department is just a huge issue that we need to get to so that we can spend money smarter. I really do think largely if we can do that the information the public needs, I think Dr. Van Winkle, to the comments you were just making, is far less than what I think we actually need internally so that we can manage our own business well. What a corporate leader wants internally is a whole lot less than the stockholder wants for what's the information, but to be able to do it well. And I will end with that. Ask the board, any final comments? Norm.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I was very impressed by the quality and the thoughtfulness of the presentations that we heard today. And every time we come together with the various user organizations, I personally have a better understanding and appreciation for the type of issues that users are experiencing with usaspending.gov. And I'm glad that our colleagues from Treasury were here today because, as you know, they are on point for leading the effort to improve federal spending transparency within the administration as we move forward. And as I think back through the conversations this morning, I'm come back to the points made by Van Daniker and by David Qualm in terms of the real emphasis on collaborative dialogue and the need for that going forward. And then also the discussion about focusing on what folks need as opposed to what folks want. And if there's a model here that I would like to point to in terms of how I think this could work, I point to the work that we've been doing in terms of grants management reform and the collaborative dialogue that we've had for more than 2 years now with the various stakeholders. And I honestly believe that because of that collaborative dialogue, we have gotten to a much better place in terms of the substance of the reforms that we rolled out. And I think that if it worked in the grants management space, it'll work in the transparency space as well. So I'm looking forward to continuing that dialogue.
I very much appreciate the presenters today, the audience, particularly from the federal and state agencies that came to listen. I will close the session. Thank you very much.